Chapter 8, Part 2 of Fanny Herself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Chapter 8, Part 2. Two conversations that took place before she left are perhaps worth recording. One was with Father Fitzpatrick of St. Ignatius Catholic Church. The other with Rabbi Emil Thaumann of Temple Emmanuel. An impulse brought her to Father Fitzpatrick's study. It was a week before her departure. She was tired. There had been much last signing of papers, nailing of boxes, strapping of trunks. When things began to come too thick and fast for her, she put on her hat and went for a walk at the close of the May day. May in Wisconsin is a thing all fragrant and gold and blue and white with cherry blossoms and pink with apple blossoms and tremulous with budding things. Fanny struck out westward through the neat streets of the little town, and found herself on the bridge over the ravine in which she had played when a little girl, the ravine that her childish imagination had peopled with such pageantry of redskin and priests and voyageurs and cavaliers. She leaned over the iron railing and looked down. Where grass and brook and wildflower had been, there now oozed great eruptions of ash heaps, tin cans, broken bottles, mounds of dirt. Winnebago's growing pains had begun. Fanny turned away with a little sick feeling. She went on across the bridge past the Catholic church. Just next to the church was the parish house where Father Fitzpatrick lived. It always looked as if it had been scrubbed inside and out with a scouring brick. Its windows were a reproach and a challenge to every housekeeper in Winnebago. Fanny wanted to talk to somebody about that ravine. She was full of it. Father Fitzpatrick's study overlooked it. Besides, she wanted to see him before she left Winnebago. A picture came to her mind of his handsome, ruddy face, twinkling with humor, as she had last seen it when he had dropped in at Brandeis's bazaar for a chat with her mother. She turned in at the gate and ran up the immaculate gray-painted steps that always gleamed as though still wet with the paintbrush. "I shouldn't wonder if that housekeeper of his comes out with a pail of paint and does them every morning before breakfast," Fanny said to herself as she rang the bell. Usually it was that sparse and speckled person herself who opened the parish house door, but today Fanny's ring was answered by Father Casey, parish assistant. A sour-nosed and suspicious young man, Father Casey, thick-speckled and pointed of nose. Nothing of the jolly priest about him. He was new to the town, but he recognized Fanny and surveyed her darkly. "Father Fitzpatrick in? I'm Fanny Brandeis." "The Reverend Father is busy," and the glass door began to close. "Who is it?" boomed a voice from within. "Who are you turning away, Casey?" "A woman, not a parishioner." The door was almost shut now. Footsteps down the hall. "Good! Let her in." The door opened ever so reluctantly. Father Fitzpatrick loomed up beside his puny assistant, dwarfing him. He looked sharply at the figure on the porch. "For the love of Casey, you're a fool! How you ever got beyond being an altar boy is more than I can see. Come in, child, come in. The man's cut out for a jailer, not a priest." Fanny's two hands were caught in one of his big ones, and she was led down the hall to the study. It was the room of a scholar and a man, and the one spot in the house that defied the housekeeper's weapons of broom and duster. A comfortable and disreputable room, full of books and fishing tackle, and chairs with sagging springs, and a sofa that was dented with friendly hollows. Pipes on the disorderly desk. A copy of Mr. Dooley, spread face down on what appeared to be next Sunday's sermon, rough drafted. "I just wanted to talk to you." Fanny drifted to the shelves, book lover that she was, and ran a finger over half a dozen titles. "Your assistant was justified, really, in closing the door on me. But I'm glad you rescued me." She came over to him and stood looking up at him. He seemed to loom up endlessly, though hers was a medium height. "I think I really wanted to talk to you about that ravine, though I came to say good-bye." "Sit down, child, sit down." He creaked into his great leather upholstered desk chair himself. "If you had left without seeing me, I'd have excommunicated Casey. Between you and me, the man's mad. His job ought to be duenna to a Spanish maiden, not assistant to a priest with a leaning toward the flesh." Now Father Fitzpatrick talked with no, you couldn't call it a brogue. It was nothing so gross as that. One does not speak of the flavor of a rare wine. One calls attention to its bouquet. A subtle, teasing, elusive something that just tickles the senses instead of punching them in the ribs. So his speech was permeated with a will-o'-the-wisp a tingling richness that evaded definition. You will have to imagine it. There shall be no vain attempt to set it down. Besides, you always skip dialect. So you're going away, I'd heard. Where to? Chicago. Haynes Cooper. It's a wonderful chance. I don't see yet how I got it. There's only one other woman on their business staff. I mean, actually working in an executive way, in the buying and selling end of the business. Of course, there are thousands doing clerical work and that kind of thing. Have you ever been through the plant? It's incredible. Father Fitzpatrick drummed his fingers on the arm of his chair, and looked at Fanny, his handsome eyes half shut. So it's going to be business, Well, I suppose it's only natural. Your mother and I used to talk about you often. I don't know if you and she ever spoke seriously of this little trick of drawing, or cartooning, or whatever it is you have. She used to think about it. She said once to me that it looked to her more than just a knack, an authentic gift of caricature, she called it, if it only could be developed. But of course Theodore took everything. That worried her. Oh, nonsense, that! I just amuse myself with it. Yes, but what amuses you might amuse other people. There's all too few amusing things in the world. Your mother was a smart woman, Fanny. The smartest I ever knew. There's no money in it, even if I were to get on with it. What could I do with it? Who ever heard of a woman cartoonist? And I couldn't illustrate. Those pink cheesecloth pictures the magazines use. I want to earn money, lots of it, and now. She got up and went to the window, and stood there looking down the steep green slope of the ravine that lay, a natural amphitheater, just below. Money, mused Father Fitzpatrick. Well, it's popular and handy, and you look to me like the kind of girl who'd get it, once you started out for it. I've never had much myself. They say it has a way of turning to dust and ashes in the mouth, once you get a good satisfying bite of it. But that's only talk, I suppose. Fanny laughed a little, still looking at the ravine. I'm fairly accustomed to dust and ashes by this time. It won't be a new taste to me. She whirled around suddenly. And speaking of dust and ashes, isn't this a shame? A crime? Why doesn't somebody stop it? Why don't you stop it? She pointed to the desecrated ravine below. Her eyes were blazing, her face all animation. Father Fitzpatrick came over and stood beside her. His face was sad. He stopped abruptly and looked down into her glowing face. He cleared his throat. It's a perfectly natural state of affairs, he said smoothly. Winnebago's growing, especially over there on the west side since the new mill went up, and they've extended the streetcar line. They need the land to build on. It's business and money. Business! It's a crime! It's wanton! Those ravines are the most beautiful natural spots in Wisconsin. Why, they're history and romance and beauty. So that's the way you feel about it? Of course, don't you? Can't you stop it? Petitions? Certainly I feel it's an outrage, but I'm just a poor fool of a priest, and sentimental, with no head for business. Now you're a businesswoman, and different. You're joking. Say, listen, my girl, the world's made up of just two things, ravines and dump heaps. And the dumpers are forever edging up and squeeging up, and trying to grab the ravines and spoil them when nobody's looking. You've made your choice, and allied yourself with the dump heaps. What right have you to cry out against the desecration of the ravines? The right that everyone has that loves them. Child, you're going to get so used to seeing your ravines choked up at Haynes Cooper that after a while you'll prefer 'em that way. Fanny turned on him passionately. I won't. And if I do, perhaps it's just as well. There's such a thing as too much ravine. What do you want me to do? Stay here and grub away and become a crabbed old maid like Irma Klein, thankful to be taken around by the married crowd, joining the Aid Society, and going to the card parties on Sunday nights? Or I could marry a traveling man, perhaps, or Lee Cohn of the Golden Eagle. I'm just like any other ambitious woman with brains. No, you're not. You're different. And I'll tell you why. You're a Jew. Yes, I've got that handicap. That isn't a handicap, Fanny. It's an asset. Outwardly, you're like any other girl of your age. Inwardly, you've been molded by occupation, training, religion, history, temperament, race, into something. Ethnologists have proved that there's no such thing as a Jewish race, she interrupted pertly. Maybe. I don't know what you'd call it then. You can't take a people and persecute them for thousands of years, hounding them from place to place, hurting them in dark and filthy streets, without leaving some sort of brand on them, a mark that differentiates. Sometimes it doesn't show outwardly, but it's there inside. You know, Fanny, how it's always been said that no artist can become a genius until he has suffered? You've suffered, you Jews, for centuries and centuries. until you're all artists. Quick to see drama because you've lived in it, emotional, oversensitive, cringing or swaggering, high-strung, demonstrative, affectionate, generous. Maybe they're right. Perhaps it isn't a race. But what do you call the thing, then, that made you draw me as you did that morning when you came to 10 o'clock Mass and did a caricature of me in the pulpit? You showed up something that I've been trying to hide for 20 years, till I'd fooled everybody, including myself. My church is always packed. Nobody else there ever saw it. I'll tell you, Fanny, what I've always said. The Irish would be the greatest people in the world, if it weren't for the Jews. They laughed together at that, and the tension was relieved. Well, anyway, said Fanny, and patted his great arm, I'd rather talk to you than to any man in the world. I hope you won't be able to say that a year from now, dear girl. And so they parted. He took her to the door himself, and watched her slim figure down the street and across the ravine bridge, and thought she walked very much like her mother, shoulders squared, chin high, hips firm. He went back into the house, after surveying the sunset largely, and encountered the dour Casey in the hall. I'll type your sermon now, sir, if it's done. It isn't done, Casey, and you know it. Oh, Casey! I wish your imagination would supply that brogue, because it was such a deliciously soft and racy thing. Oh, Casey, Casey, you're a better priest than I am, but a poorer man. Fanny was to leave Winnebago the following Saturday. She had sold the last of the household furniture, and had taken a room at the Haley House. She felt very old and experienced, and sad. That, she told herself, was only natural. Leaving things to which one is accustomed is always hard. Queerly enough, it was her goodbye to Aloysius that most unnerved her. Aloysius had been taken on at Gerritson's, and the dignity of his new position sat heavily upon him. You should have seen his ties. Fanny sought him out at Gerritson's. It's floor manager of the basement I am, he said, and struck an elegant attitude against the case of Mrs. Ready-to-Wear coats. And when you come back to Winnebago, Miss Fanny, and the saints send it be soon, I'll bet you'll see me on the first floor, keeping a stern but kindly eye on the swellest trade in town. Every last thing I know I learned off your poor ma. I hope it will serve you here, Aloysius. Serve me? He bent closer. Meanin' no offense, Miss Fanny, but say, listen, once that you get a Yiddish business education into an Irish head, and there's no limit to the length he can go. If I ain't a dry goods king by the time I'm 30, I hope a packing case'll fall on me. The sight of Aloysius seemed to recall, so vividly, all that was happy and all that was hateful about Brandeis's bazaar, all the bravery and pluck and resourcefulness of the bright-eyed woman he had admiringly called his boss, that Fanny found her self-control slipping. She put out her hand rather blindly to meet his great red paw, a dressy striped cuff seemed to make it all the redder, murmured a word of thanks in return for his fervent good wishes, and fled up the basement stairs. On Friday night, she was to leave next day, she went to the temple. The evening service began at 7. At 6:30 Fanny had finished her early supper. She would drop in at Dr. Thalmann's house and walk with him to temple if he had not already gone. Nein, Herr Rabbi ist noch hier, sure, the maid said in answer to Fanny's question. The Thalmanns had a German maid, one Minna, who bullied the invalid Mrs. Thalmann, was famous for her cookies with walnuts on top, and who made life exceedingly difficult for unlinguistic callers. Rabbi Thalmann was up in his study. Fanny ran lightly up the stairs. Who is it, Emil? That Minna. Next Monday her week is up. She goes. It is I, Mrs. Thalmann, Fanny Brandeis. Na, Fanny, now what do you think? In the brightly lighted doorway of his little study appeared Rabbi Thalmann, on one foot a comfortable old Romeo, on the other a street shoe. He held out both hands. Only at supper we talked about you. Isn't that so, Harriet? He called into the darkened room. I came to say good-bye, and I thought we might walk to temple together. How's Mrs. Thalmann tonight? The little rabbi shook his head darkly and waved a dismal hand. But that was for Fanny alone. What he said was, She's really splendid today. A little tired, perhaps, but what is that? Emil, from the darkened bedroom. How can you say that? But how? What I have suffered today only. Torture. And because I say nothing, I am not sick. Go in, said Rabbi Thalmann. So Fanny went in to the woman lying yellow-faced on the pillows of the dim old-fashioned bedroom with its walnut furniture and its red plush mantel-drape. Mrs. Thalmann held out a hand. Fanny took it in hers and perched herself on the edge of the bed. She patted the dry, devitalized hand and pressed it in her own strong, electric grip. Mrs. Thalmann raised her head from the pillow. "Tell me, did she have her white apron on?" "White apron?" "Minna, the girl." "Oh." Fanny's mind jerked back to the gingham-covered figure that had opened the door for her. "Yes," she lied, "a white one, with crochet around the bottom. Quite grand." Mrs. Thalmann sank back on the pillow with a satisfied sigh. "I wonder." She shook her head. "What that girl face alone when I am helpless here." Rabbi Thalmann came into the room, both feet booted now, and placed his slippers neatly, toes out, under the bed. "Ach, Harriet, the girl is all right. You imagine. Come, Fanny." He took a great fat watch out of his pocket. "It is time to go." Mrs. Thalmann laid a detaining hand on Fanny's arm. "You will come back often here to Winnebago?" "I'm afraid not. Once a year, perhaps, to visit my graves." The sick eyes regarded the fresh young face. "Your mother, Fanny. We didn't understand her so well here in Winnebago among us Jewish ladies. She was different." Fanny's face hardened. She stood up. Yes, she was different. "She comes often into my mind now, when I am here alone, with only the four walls. We were ever doomed, we women. But how doomed! She was too smart for us, your mother. Too smart. Und eine sehr brave Frau." And suddenly Fanny, she who had resolved to set her face against all emotion and all sentiment, found herself with her glowing cheek pressed against the withered one, and it was the weak old hand that patted her now. So she lay for a moment, silent. Then she got up, straightened her hat, smiled. "Auf Wiedersehen," she said in her best German, "und gute Besserung." But the rabbi's wife shook her head. "Good by." From the hall below Dr. Thalmann called to her. "Come, child, come." Then, "Ach, the light in my study, I forgot to turn it out. Fanny, be so good, yes?" Fanny entered the bright little room, reached up to turn off the light, and paused a moment to glance about her. It was an ugly, comfortable, old-fashioned room that had never progressed beyond the what-not period. Fanny's eye was caught by certain framed pictures on the walls. They were photographs of Rabbi Thalmann's confirmation classes. Spindling-legged little boys in the splendor of patent leather buttoned shoes, stiff white shirts, black broadcloth suits with satin lapels, self-conscious and awkward little girls, those in the minority, in white dresses and stiff white hair bows. In the center of each group sat the little rabbi, very proud and alert. Fanny was not among these. She had never formally taken the vows of her creed. As she turned down the light now and found her way down the stairs, she told herself that she was glad this was so. It was a matter of only 4 blocks to the temple, but they were late, and so they hurried, and there was little conversation. Fanny's arm was tucked comfortably in his. It felt somehow startlingly thin, that arm. And as they hurried along there was a jerky feebleness about his gait. It was with difficulty that Fanny restrained herself from supporting him when they came to a rough bit of walk or a sudden step. Something fine in her prompted her not to, but the alert mind in that old frame sensed what was going on in her thoughts. "He's getting feeble, the old rabbi, hm?" "Not a bit of it. I've got all I can do to keep up with you. You set such a pace." I know. They are not all so kind, Fanny. They are too prosperous, this congregation of mine. And some day, off with his head. And in my place there will step a young man with eyeglasses instead of spectacles. They are tired of hearing about the prophets. Texts from the Bible have gone out of fashion. You think I do not see them giggling, The young people? And whispering in the choir loft? And the buzz when I get up from my chair after the second hymn? Is he going to have a sermon? Is he? Sure enough. Nah. He will let them sit up, my successor. Sex sermons. Political lectures. That's it. Lectures. They were turning in at the temple now. The race is to the young, Fanny, to the young. And I am old. She squeezed the frail old arm in hers. "My dear," she said. "My dear." A second breaking of her new resolutions. One by one, 2 by 2, they straggled in for the Friday evening service, these placid, prosperous people, not unkind, but careless, perhaps, in their prosperity. "He's worth any 10 of them," Fanny said hotly to herself, as she sat in her pew that, after tomorrow, would no longer be hers. "The dear old thing. Sex sermons. And the race is to the young. How right he is. Well, no one can say I'm not getting an early start." The choir had begun the first hymn when there came down the aisle a stranger. There was a little stir among the congregation. Visitors were rare. He was dark and very slim, with the slimness of steel wire. He passed down the aisle rather uncertainly. A traveling man, Fanny thought, dropped in, as sometimes they did, to say Kaddish for a departed father or mother. Then she changed her mind. Her quick eye noted his walk, a peculiar walk, with a spring in it. Only one unfamiliar with cement pavements could walk like that. The Indians must have had that same light, muscular step. He chose an empty pew halfway down the aisle and stumbled into it rather awkwardly. Fanny thought he was unnecessarily ugly, even for a man. Then he looked up and nodded and smiled at Lee Kohn across the aisle. His teeth were very white, and the smile was singularly sweet. Fanny changed her mind again. Not so bad looking after all. Different, anyway. And then, why, of course! Little Clarence Hale, come back from the West. Clarence Hale, the cowardy cat. Her mind went back to that day of the street fight. She smiled. At that moment Clarence Hale, who had been screwing about most shockingly, as though searching for someone, turned and met her smile, intended for no one, with a startlingly radiant one of his own, intended most plainly for her. He half started forward in his pew, and then remembered, and sat back again, but with an effect of impermanence that was ludicrous. It had been years since he had left Winnebago. At the time of his mother's death they had tried to reach him, and had been unable to get in touch with him for weeks. He had been off on some mountain expedition, hundreds of miles from railroad or telegraph. Fanny remembered having read about him in the Winnebago Courier. He seemed to be climbing mountains a great deal, rather difficult mountains, evidently, from the fuss they made over it. A queer enough occupation for a cowardy cat. There had been a book, too, about the Rockies. She had not read it. She rather disliked these nature books, as do most nature lovers. She told herself that when she came upon a flaming golden maple in October, she was content to know it was a maple, and to warm her soul at its blaze. There had been something in the Chicago Herald, though, oh yes, it had spoken of him as the brilliant young naturalist, Clarence Hale. He was to have gone on an expedition with Roosevelt. A sprained ankle, or some such thing, had prevented. Fanny smiled again to herself. His mother, the fussy person who had been responsible for his boyhood reefers and 2 shiny shoes, and his cowardice too, no doubt, had dreamed of seeing her Clarence a rabbi. From that point Fanny's thoughts wandered to the brave old man in the pulpit. She had heard almost nothing of the service. She looked at him now, at him, and then at his congregation, inattentive and palpably bored. As always with her, the thing stamped itself on her mind as a picture. She was forever seeing a situation in terms of its human value. How small he looked, how frail, against the background of the massive ark with its red velvet curtain. And how bravely he glared over his blue glasses at the 2 Aarons girls who were whispering and giggling together, eyes on the newcomer. So this was what life did to you, was it? Squeezed you dry, and then cast you aside in your old age, a pulp, a bit of discard? Well, they'd never catch her that way. Unchurchly thoughts, these. The place was very peaceful and quiet, lulling one like a narcotic. The rabbi's voice had in it that soothing monotony bred of years in the pulpit. Fanny found her thoughts straying back to the busy, bright little store on Elm Street, then forward to the Haynes Cooper plant and the fight that was before her. There settled about her mouth a certain grim line that sat strangely on so young a face. The service marched on. There came the organ prelude that announced the mourner's prayer. Then Rabbi Thalmann began to intone the Kaddish. Fanny rose, prayer book in hand. At that Clarence Hale rose too, hurriedly, as one unaccustomed to the service, and stood with unbowed head, looking at the rabbi interestedly, thoughtfully, reverently. The 2 stood alone. Death had been kind to Congregation Emmanuel this year. The prayer ended. Fanny winked the tears from her eyes almost wrathfully. She sat down, and there swept over her a feeling of finality. It was like the closing of Book 1 in a volume made up of 3 parts. She said to herself, Winnebago is ended, and my life here. How interesting that I should know that and feel it. It is like the first movement in one of the concertos Theodore was forever playing. Now for the second movement. It's got to be lively, fortissimo, presto. For so clever a girl as Fanny Brandeis, that was a stupid conclusion at which to arrive. How could she think it possible to shed her past life like a garment? Those impressionable years, between 14 and 24, could never be cast off. She might don a new cloak to cover the old dress beneath, but the old would always be there, its folds peeping out here and there, its outlines plainly to be seen. She might eat of things rare and drink of things costly, but the sturdy, stocky little girl in the made-over silk dress, who had resisted the devil in Weinberg's pantry on that long-ago Day of Atonement, would always be there at the feast. Myself, I confess, I am tired of these stories of young women who go to the big city, there to do battle with failure, to grapple with temptation, sin, and discouragement. So it may as well be admitted that Fanny Brandeis' story was not that of a painful, hand-over-hand climb. She was made for success. What she attempted, she accomplished. That which she strove for, she won. She was too sure, too vital, too electric for failure. No, Fanny Brandeis' struggle went on inside, and in trying to stifle it she came near making the blackest failure that a woman can make. In grubbing for the pot of gold, she almost missed the rainbow. Rabbi Thalmann raised his arms for the benediction. Fanny looked straight up at him as though stamping a picture on her mind. His eyes were resting gently on her, or perhaps she just fancied that he spoke to her alone as he began the words of the ancient closing prayer. May the blessings of the Lord our God rest upon you. God bless thee and keep thee. May he cause his countenance to shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. May God lift up his countenance unto thee. At the last word she hurried up the aisle and down the stairs into the soft beauty of the May night. She felt she could stand no goodbyes. In her hotel room she busied herself with the half-packed trunks and bags. So it was, she altogether failed to see the dark young man who hurried after her eagerly, but who was stopped by a dozen welcoming hands there in the temple vestibule. He swore an inward "Damn!" as he saw her straight, slim figure disappear down the steps and around the corner, even while he found himself saying politely, "Why, thanks, it's good to be back," and, "Yes, things have changed," all but the temple and Rabbi Thalmann. Fanny left Winnebago at 8 next morning. End of chapter 8. Fanny Herself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Chapter 9. Mr. Fanger will see you now. Mr. Fanger, general manager, had been a long time about it. This heel-cooling experience was new to Fanny Brandeis. It had always been her privilege to keep others waiting. Still, she felt no resentment as she sat in Michael Fenger's outer office. For as she sat there waiting, she was getting a distinct impression of this unseen man whose voice she could just hear as he talked over the telephone in his inner office. It was characteristic of Michael Fenger that his personality reached out and touched you before you came into actual contact with the man. Fanny had heard of him long before she came to Haynes Cooper. He was the genie of that glittering lamp. All through the gigantic plant she had already met department heads, buyers, merchandise managers. One heard his name and felt the impress of his mind. "You'll have to see Mr. Fenger about that." "Yes," pointing to a new conveyor perhaps. "That has just been installed. It's a great help to us. Doubles our shipping room efficiency. We used to use baskets pulled by a rope. It's Mr. Fenger's idea." Efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. Fanger had made it a slogan in the Haynes Cooper plant long before the German nation forced it into our everyday vocabulary. Michael Fenger was system. He could take a muddle of orders, a jungle of unfilled contracts, a horde of incompetent workers, and of them make a smooth-running and effective unit. Untangling snarls was his pastime, esprit de corps was his shibboleth, order and management his idols, and his war cry was "Results!" It was 11 o'clock when Fanny came into his outer office. The very atmosphere was vibrant with his personality. There hung about the place an air of repressed expectancy. The room was electrically charged with the high voltage of the man in the inner office. His secretary was a spare, middle-aged, anxious-looking woman in snuff-brown and spectacles. His stenographer a blond young man, also spectacled and anxious. His office boy a stern youth in knickers, who bore no relation to the slangy, gum-chewing red-headed office boy of the comic sections. The low-pitched, high-powered voice went on inside, talking over the long-distance telephone. Fenger was the kind of man who is always talking to New York when he is in Chicago, and to Chicago when he is in New York. Trains with the word limited after them were invented for him and his type. A buzzer sounded. It galvanized the office boy into instant action. It brought the anxious-looking stenographer to the doorway, notebook in hand, ready. It sent the lean secretary out and up to Fanny. Temper, Fanny said to herself, are horribly nervous and high-keyed. They jump like a set of puppets on a string. It was then that the lean secretary had said, "Mr. Fenger will see you now." Fanny was aware of a pleasant little tingle of excitement. She entered the inner office. It was characteristic of Michael Fenger that he employed no cheap tricks. He was not writing as Fanny Brandeis came in. He was not telephoning. He was not doing anything but standing at his desk, waiting for Fanny Brandeis. As she came in he looked at her, through her, and she seemed to feel her mental processes laid open to him as a skilled surgeon cuts through skin and flesh and fat, to lay bare the muscles and nerves and vital organs beneath. He put out his hand. Fanny extended hers. They met in a silent grip. It was like a meeting between two men. Even as he indexed her, Fanny's alert mind was busy docketing, numbering, cataloging him. They had in common a certain force, a driving power. Fanny seated herself opposite him, in obedience to a gesture. He crossed his legs comfortably and sat back in his big desk chair. A great-bodied man with powerful square shoulders, a long head, a rugged crest of a nose, the kind you see on the type of Englishman who has the imagination and initiative to go to Canada or Australia or America. He wore spectacles, not the fashionable horn-rimmed sort, but the kind with gold earpieces. They were becoming, and gave a certain humanness to a face that otherwise would have been too rugged, too strong. A man of 45, perhaps. He spoke first. "You're younger than I thought." "So are you." "Old inside." "So am I." He uncrossed his legs, leaned forward, folded his arms on the desk. "You've been through the plant, Miss Brandeis?" "Yes, twice. Once with a regular tourist party, and once with the special guide." "Good. Go through the plant whenever you can. Don't stick to your own department. It narrows one." He paused a moment. "Did you think that this opportunity to come to Haynes Cooper as assistant to the infants' wear department buyer was just a piece of luck, augmented by a little pulling on your part?" "Yes." "It wasn't. You were carefully picked by me, and I don't expect to find I've made a mistake. I suppose you know very little about buying and selling infants' wear?" "Less than about almost any other article in the world, at least in the department store or mail order world." "I thought so. And it doesn't matter. I pretty well know your history, which means I know your training. You're young, you're ambitious. You're experienced, you're imaginative. There's no length you can't go with these. It just depends on how far-sighted your mental vision is. Now listen, Miss Brandeis. I'm not going to talk to you in millions. The guides do enough of that. But you know we do buy and sell in terms of millions, don't you? Well, our infants' wear department isn't helping to roll up the millions, and it ought to, because there are millions of babies born every year, and the golden spoon kind are in the minority. I've decided that the department needs a woman, your kind of woman. Now, as a rule, I never employ a woman when I can use a man. There's only one other woman filling a really important position in the merchandise end of this business. That's Ella Monahan, head of the glove department, and she's a genius. She's a woman who is limited in every other respect, just average, but she knows glove materials in a way that's uncanny. I'd rather have a man in her place, but I don't happen to know any men glove geniuses. Tell me, what do you think of that etching?" Fanny tried, and successfully, not to show the jolt her mind had received, as she turned to look at the picture to which his finger pointed. She got up and strolled over to it, and she was glad her suit fitted and hung as it did in the back. "I don't like it particularly. I like it less than any other etching you have here." The walls were hung with them. "Of course you understand I know nothing about them. But it's too flowery, isn't it, to be good? Too many lines. Like a writer who spoils his effect by using too many words." Fanger came over and stood beside her, staring at the black and white and gray thing in its frame. "I felt that way, too." He stared down at her then. "Jew?" he asked. A breathless instant. "No," said Fanny Brandeis. Michael Fenger smiled for the first time. Fanny Brandeis would have given everything she had, everything she hoped to be able to take back that monosyllable. She was gripped with horror at what she had done. She had spoken almost mechanically. And yet that monosyllable must have been the fruit of all these months of inward struggle and thought. "Now I begin to understand you," Fenger went on. "You've decided to lop off all the extra senses, eh? Well, I can't say that I blame you. A woman in business is handicapped enough by the fact of her sex." He stared at her again. "Too bad you're so pretty." "I'm not," said Fanny hotly, like a schoolgirl. "That's a thing that can't be argued, child. Beauty's subjective, you know." "I don't see what difference it makes anyway." "Oh, yes, you do." He stopped. "Or perhaps you don't, after all. I forget how young you are. Well, now, Miss Brandeis, you and your woman's mind and your masculine business experience and sense are to be turned loose on our infants' wear department. The buyer, Mr. Slosson, is going to resent you. Naturally. I don't know whether we'll get results from you in a month, or 6 months, or a year, or ever. But something tells me we're going to get them. You've lived in a small town most of your life, and we want that small town viewpoint. Do you think you've got it? Fanny was on her own ground here. If knowing the Wisconsin small-town woman, and the Wisconsin farmer woman, and man too for that matter, means knowing the Oregon and Wyoming and Pennsylvania and Iowa people of the same class, then I've got it. Good. Michael Fenger stood up. I'm not going to load you down with instructions or advice. I think I'll let you grope your own way around and bump your head a few times. Then you'll learn where the low places are. And, Miss Brandeis, remember that suggestions are welcome in this plant. We take suggestions all the way from the elevator starter to the president. His tone was kindly, but not hopeful. Fanny was standing too, her mental eye on the door, but now she turned to face him squarely. Do you mean that? Absolutely. Well, then, I've one to make. Your stock boys and stock girls walk miles and miles every day, on every floor of this 15-story building. I watched them yesterday, filling up the bins, carrying orders, covering those enormous distances from one bin to another, up one aisle and down the next, to the office, back again. Your floors are concrete or cement or some such mixture, aren't they? I just happened to think of the boy who used to deliver our paper on Norris Street in Winnebago, Wisconsin. He covered his route on roller skates. It saved him an hour. Why don't you put roller skates on your stock boys and girls? Fenger stared at her. You could almost hear that mind of his working, like a thing on ball bearings. Roller skates! It wasn't an exclamation. It was a decision. He pressed a buzzer, the snuff-brown secretary buzzer. Tell Clancy I want him, now. He had not glanced up, or taken his eyes from Fanny. She was aware of feeling a little uncomfortable, but elated, too. She moved toward the door. Fenger stood at his desk. Wait a minute. Fanny waited. Still Fenger did not speak. Finally, I suppose you know you've earned 6 months' salary in the last 5 minutes. Fanny eyed him coolly. Considering the number of your stock force, the time, energy, and labor saved, including wear and tear on the department heads and their assistants, I should say that was a conservative statement. And she nodded pleasantly and left him. 2 days later, every stock clerk in the vast plant was equipped with lightweight roller skates. They made a sort of carnival of it at first. There were some spills, too, going around corners, and a little too much hilarity. That wore off in a week. In 2 weeks their roller skates were part of them, just shop labor savers. The report presented to Fenger was this. Time and energy saved, 55%. Stock staff decreased by 1/3. The picturesqueness of it, and the almost ludicrous simplicity of the idea appealed to the entire plant. It tickled the humor sense of every one of the 10,000 employees in that vast organization. In the first week of her association with Haynes Cooper, Fanny Brandeis was actually more widely known than men who had worked there for years. The president, Nathan Haynes himself, sent for her, chuckling. Nathan Haynes, but then why stop for him? Nathan Haynes had been swallowed, long ago, by this monster plant that he himself had innocently created. You must have visited it, this gargantuan thing that sprawls its length in the very center of Chicago, the giant son of a surprised father. It is one of the city's show places, like the stockyards, the Art Institute, and Fields. 15 years before, a building had been erected to accommodate a prosperous mail-order business. It had been built large and roomy, with plenty of seams, planned amply, it was thought, to allow the boy to grow. It would do for 25 years, surely. In 10 years, Haynes Cooper was bursting its seams. In 12, it was shamelessly naked, its arms and legs sticking out of its inadequate garments. New red brick buildings. Another. 5 stories added to this one, 6 stories to that. A new 15-story merchandise building. The firm began to talk in tens of millions. Its stock became gilt-edged, unattainable. Lucky ones who had bought of it diffidently, discreetly, with modest visions of 4.5% in their unimaginative minds, saw their dividends doubling, trebling, quadrupling, finally soaring gymnastically beyond all reason. Listen to the old guide who, at 15 a week, takes groups of awed visitors through the great plant. How he juggles figures, how grandly they roll off his tongue, how glib he is with Nathan Haynes' millions. This, ladies and gentlemen, is our mail department. From 2,000 to 2,500 pounds of mail, comprising over 100,000 letters, are received here every day. Yes, madam, I said every day. About half of these letters are orders. Last year the banking department counted $130 millions of dollars. $130 millions! He stands there in his ill-fitting coat and his star, and rubs one bony hand over the other. "Dear me!" says a lady tourist from Idaho, rather inadequately. And yet not so inadequately. What exclamation is there, please, that fits a sum like 130 millions of anything? Fanny Brandeis, fresh from Winnebago, Wisconsin, slipped into the great scheme of things at the Haynes Cooper plant like part of a perfectly planned blueprint. It was as though she had been thought out and shaped for this particular corner. And the reason for it was, primarily, Winnebago, Wisconsin. For Haynes Cooper grew and thrived on just such towns, with their surrounding farms and villages. Haynes Cooper had their fingers on the pulse and heart of the country, as did no other industry. They were close. Close. When rugs began to take the place of ingrain carpets, it was Haynes Cooper who first sensed the change. Oh, they had had them in New York years before, certainly. But after all, it isn't New York's artistic progress that shows the development of this nation. It is the thing they are thinking and doing and learning in backwash Nebraska that marks time for these United States. There may be a certain significance in the announcement that New York has dropped the Russian craze and has gone in for that quaint Chinese stuff. My dear, it makes the loveliest hangings and decorations. When Fifth Avenue takes down its filet lace and eyelet embroidered curtains, and substitutes severe shantung and chaste net, there is little in the act to revolutionize industry or stir the art world. But when the Haynes Cooper Company, by referring to its inventory ledgers, learns that it is selling more Alma Gluck than Harry Lauder records, when its statistics show that Tchaikovsky is going better than Irving Berlin, something epical is happening in the musical progress of a nation. And when the orders from Noose Gulch, Nevada, are for those plain dimity curtains instead of the cheap and gaudy Nottingham atrocities, there is conveyed to the mind a fact of immense, of overwhelming significance. The country has taken a step toward civilization and good taste. So, you have a skeleton sketch of Haynes Cooper, whose feelers reach the remotest dugout in the Yukon, the most isolated cabin in the Rockies, the loneliest ranch house in Wyoming, the Montana mining shack, the bleak Maine farm, the plantation in Virginia. And the man who so innocently put life into this monster? A plumpish, kindly-faced man, a bewildered, gentle, unimaginative, and somewhat frightened man, fresh-cheeked, eye-glassed. In his suite of offices in the new administration building, built 2 years ago, marble and oak throughout, 12 stories, and we're adding 3 already, offices all two-toned rugs and leather upholstery, with dim, rich, brown-toned Dutch masterpieces on the walls, he sat helpless and defenseless, while the torrent of millions rushed and swirled and foamed about him. I think he had fancied, 15 years ago, that he would some day be a fairly prosperous man, not rich, as riches are counted nowadays, but with a comfortable number of tens of thousands tucked away. 200,000 or 300,000, perhaps 500,000, perhaps but nonsense, nonsense! And then the thing had started. It was as when a man idly throws a pebble into a chasm, or shoves a bit of ice with the toe of his boot, and starts a snowslide that grows as it goes. He had started this avalanche of money, and now it rushed on of its own momentum, plunging, rolling, leaping, crashing, and as it swept on it gathered rocks, trees, stones, houses, everything that lay in its way. It was beyond the power of human hand to stop this tumbling, roaring slide. In the midst of it sat Nathan Haynes, deafened, stunned, terrified at the immensity of what he had done. He began giving away huge sums, incredible sums. It piled up faster than he could give it away. And so he sat there in the office hung with the dim old masterpieces, and tried to keep simple, tried to keep sane, with that austerity that only mad wealth can afford, or bitter poverty. He caused the land about the plant to be laid out in sunken gardens and baseball fields and tennis courts, so that one approached this monster of commerce through enchanting grounds, glowing with tulips and heady hyacinths in the spring, with roses in June, blazing with salvia and golden glow with asters in autumn. There was something apologetic about these grounds. This, then, was the environment that Fanny Brandeis had chosen. On the face of things you would have said she had chosen well. The inspiration of the roller skates had not been merely a lucky flash. That idea had been part of the consistent whole. Her mind was her mother's mind raised to the nth power, and enhanced by the genius she was trying to crush. Refusing to die, it found expression in 100 brilliant plans, of which the roller skate idea was only one. Fanny had reached Chicago on Sunday. She had entered the city as a queen enters her domain, authoritatively, with no fear upon her, no trepidation, no doubts. She had gone at once to the Mendota Hotel on Michigan Avenue, uptown, away from the roar of the Loop. It was a residential hotel, very quiet, decidedly luxurious. She had no idea of making it her home. But she would stay here until she could find an apartment that was small, bright, near the lake, and yet within fairly reasonable transportation facilities for her work. Her room was on the 9th floor, not on the Michigan Avenue side, but east, overlooking the lake. She spent hours at the windows, fascinated by the stone and steel city that lay just below, with the incredible blue of the sail-dotted lake beyond, and at night, with the lights spangling the velvety blackness, the flaring blaze of 31st Street's chop suey restaurants and moving picture houses at the right, and far, far away, the red and white eye of the lighthouse, winking, blinking, winking, blinking, the rumble and clank of a flat-wheeled Indiana Avenue car, the sound of laughter and a snatch of song that came faintly up to her from the speeding car of some midnight joyriders. But all this had to do with her other side. It had no bearing on Haynes Cooper and business. Business, that was it. She had trained herself for it, like an athlete. 8 hours of sleep, a cold plunge on arising, sane food, long walks. There was something terrible about her earnestness. On Monday she presented herself at the Haynes Cooper plant. Monday and Tuesday were spent in going over the great works. It was an exhausting process, but fascinating beyond belief. It was on Wednesday that she had been summoned for the talk with Michael Fenger. Thursday morning she was at her desk at 8:30. It was an obscure desk, in a dingy corner of the infants' wear department, the black sheep section of the great plant. Her very presence in that corner seemed to change it magically. You must remember how young she was, how healthy, how vigorous, with the freshness of the small town still upon her. It was health and youth and vigor that gave that gloss to her hair, conscientious brushing, too, perhaps, that color to her cheeks and lips, that brightness to her eyes. But crafty art and her dramatic instinct were responsible for the tailored severity of her costume, for the whiteness of her blouse, the trim, common-sense expensiveness of her shoes and hat and gloves. Slosson, buyer and head of the department, came in at 9. Fanny rose to greet him. She felt a little sorry for Slosson. In her mind she already knew him for a doomed man. "Well, well." He was the kind of person who would say, "Well, well. You're bright and early, Miss, Brandeis." "Yes, certainly, Miss Brandeis. Well, nothing like making a good start." "I wanted to go through the department by myself," said Fanny. "The shelves and bins and the numbering system. I see that your new maternity dresses have just come in." "Oh, yes. How do you like them?" "I think they're unnecessarily hideous, Mr. Slosson." "My dear young lady, a plain garment is what they want. Unnoticeable." "Unnoticeable, yes, but becoming. At such a time a woman is at her worst. If she can get it, she at least wants a dress that doesn't add to her unattractiveness." "Let me see. You are not married, I believe, Miss Brandeis?" "No." "I am. 3 children, all girls." He passed a nervous hand over his head, rumpling his hair a little. "An expensive proposition, let me tell you, 3 girls. But there's very little I don't know about babies, as you may imagine." But there settled over Fanny Brandeis's face the mask of hardness that was so often to transform it. The morning mail was in, the day's biggest grist, deluge of it, a flood. Buyer and assistant buyer never saw the actual letters, or attended to their enclosed orders. It was only the unusual letter, the complaint or protest that reached their desk. Hundreds of hands downstairs sorted, stamped, indexed, filed, after the letter-opening machines had slit the envelopes. Those letter-openers! Fanny had hung over them, enthralled. The unopened envelopes were fed into them. Flip, zip, flip, out, opened. Faster than the eye could follow. It was uncanny. It was somehow humorous, like the clever antics of a trained dog. You could not believe that this little machine actually performed what your eyes beheld. 2 years later they installed the sandpaper letter opener, marvel of simplicity. It made the old machine seem cumbersome and slow. Guided by Izzy, the expert, its rough tongue was capable of licking open 650 letters a minute. 10 minutes after the mail came in the orders were being filled. Bins, shelves, warehouses were emptying their contents. Up and down the aisles went the stock clerks, into the conveyors went the bundles, down the great spiral bundle chute, into the shipping room, out by mail, by express, by freight. This leghorn hat for a Nebraska country belle, a tombstone for a rancher's wife, a plow brave in its red paint, coffee, tea, tinned fruit bound for Alaska, lace, muslin, sheeting, toweling, all intended for the coarse trousseau of a Georgia bride. It was not remarkable that Fanny Brandeis fitted into this scheme of things. For years she had ministered to the wants of just this type of person. The letters she saw at Haynes Cooper's read exactly as customers had worded their wants at Brandeis's Bazaar. The magnitude of the thing thrilled her, the endless possibilities of her own position. During the first 2 months of her work there she was as unaggressive as possible. She opened the very pores of her mind and absorbed every detail of her department. But she said little, followed Slosson's instructions in her position as assistant buyer, and suggested no changes. Slosson's wrinkle of anxiety smoothed itself away, and his manner became patronizingly authoritative again. Fanny seemed to have become part of the routine of the place. Fanger did not send for her. June and July were insufferably hot. Fanny seemed to thrive, to expand like a flower in the heat, when others wilted and shriveled. The spring catalogue was to be made up in October, as always, 6 months in advance. The first week in August Fanny asked for an interview with Fanger. Slosson was to be there. At 10 o'clock she entered Fanger's inner office. He was telephoning, something about dinner at the Union League Club. His voice was suave, his tone well modulated, his accent correct, his English faultless. And yet Fanny Brandeis, studying the etchings on his wall, her back turned to him, smiled to herself. The voice, the tone, the accent, the English, did not ring true. They were acquired graces, exquisite imitations of the real thing. Fanny Brandeis knew. She was playing the same game herself. She understood this man now, after 2 months in the Haynes Cooper plant. These marvelous examples of the etcher's art, for example. They were the struggle for expression of a man whose youth had been bare of such things. His love for them was much the same as that which impels the new-made millionaire to buy rare pictures, rich hangings, tapestries, rugs, not so much in the desire to impress the world with his wealth as to satisfy the craving for beauty, the longing to possess that which is exquisite and fine and almost unobtainable. You have seen how a woman, long denied luxuries, feeds her starved senses on soft silken things, on laces and gleaming jewels, for pure sensuous delight in their feel and look. Thus Fanny mused as she eyed these treasures, grim, deft, repressed things, done with that economy of line which is the test of the etcher's art. Fanger hung up the receiver. "So it's taken you 2 months, Miss Brandeis. I was awfully afraid, from the start you made, that you'd be back here in a week, bursting with ideas." Fanny smiled appreciatively. He had come very near the truth. "I had to use all my self-control that first week. After that it wasn't so hard." Fanger's eyes narrowed upon her. "Pretty sure of yourself, aren't you?" "Yes," said Fanny. She came over to his desk. "I wish we didn't have Mr. Slosson here this morning. After all, he's been here for years, and I'm practically an upstart. He's so much older, too. I hate to hurt him. I wish you'd—" But Fanger shook his head. "Slosson's due now. And he has to take his medicine. This is business, Miss Brandeis. You ought to know what that means. For that matter, it may be that you haven't hit upon an idea. In that case, Slosson would have the laugh, wouldn't he?" Slosson entered at that moment, and there was a chip on his shoulder. It was evident in the way he bristled, in the way he seated himself. His fingers drummed his knees. He was like a testy, hum-ha stage father dealing with a willful child. Fanger took out his watch. "Now, Miss Brandeis." Fanny took a chair facing the two men, and crossed her trim blue serge knees, and folded her hands in her lap. A deep pink glowed in her cheeks. Her eyes were very bright. All the Molly Brandeis in her was at the surface, sparkling there, and she looked almost insultingly youthful. You want me to talk?" "We want you to talk. We have time for just 3/4 of an hour of uninterrupted conversation. If you've got anything to say, you ought to say it in that time. Now, Miss Brandeis, what's the trouble with the Haynes Cooper infants' wear department?" And Fanny Brandeis took a long breath. "The trouble with the Haynes Cooper infants' wear department is that it doesn't understand women. There are millions of babies born every year. An incredible number of them are mail order babies. I mean by that they are born to tired, clumsy-fingered immigrant women, to women in mills and factories, to women on farms, to women in remote villages. They're the type who use the mail order method. I've learned this one thing about that sort of woman. She may not want that baby, but either before or after it's born she'll starve and save and go without proper clothing, and even beg and steal to give it clothes. Clothes with lace on them, with ribbon on them, sheer white things. I don't know why that's true, but it is. Well, we're not reaching them. Our goods are unattractive. They're packed and shipped unattractively. Why, all this department needs is a little psychology. And some lace that doesn't look as if it's been chopped out with an axe. It's the little, silly, intimate things that will reach these women. No, not silly, either. Quite understandable. She wants fine things for her baby, just as the silver spoon mother does. The thing we'll have to do is to give her silver spoon models at pewter prices. It can't be done, said Slosson. Now wait a minute, Slosson, Fanger put in smoothly. Miss Brandeis has given us a very fair general statement. We'll have some facts. Are you prepared to give us an actual working plan? Yes, at least it sounds practical to me. And if it does to you, and to Mr. Slosson, humph, snorted that gentleman, an expression of defiance, unbelief, and a determination not to be impressed. It acted as a goad to Fanny. She leaned forward in her chair and talked straight at the big potent force that sat regarding her in silent attention. I still say that we can copy the high-priced models in low-priced materials because, in almost every case, it isn't the material that makes the expensive model, it's the line, the cut, the little trick that gives it style. We can get that. We've been giving them stuff that might have been made by prison labor for all the distinction it had. Then I think we ought to make a feature of the sanitary methods used in our infants department. Every article intended for a baby's use should be wrapped or boxed as it lies in the bin or on the shelf, and those bins ought to be glassed. We would advertise that, and it would advertise itself. Our visitors would talk about it. This department hasn't been getting a square deal in the catalog, not enough space. It ought to have not only more catalog space, but a catalog all its own, the baby book, full of pictures, good ones. Illustrations that will make every mother think her baby will look like that baby, once it is wearing our number 29E798, chubby babies, curly-haired and dimply. And the feature of the catalog ought to be, not separate garments, but complete outfits. Outfits boxed, ready for shipping, and ranging in price all the way from $25 to $3.98. It can't be done, yelled Slosson. $3.98? Outfits? It can be done. I figured it out down to a packet of assorted size safety pins. We'll call it our emergency outfit. 30 pieces. And while we're about it, every outfit over $5 ought to be packed in a pink or pale blue pasteboard box. The outfits trimmed in pink, pink boxes. The outfits trimmed in blue, blue boxes. In 8 cases out of 10, their letters will tell us whether it is a pink or blue baby. And when they get our package and take out that pink or blue box, they'll be as pleased as if we'd made them a present. It's the personal note. Personal slop, growled Slosson. It isn't business, it's sentimental slush. Sentimental, yes, agreed Fanny pleasantly. But then, we're running the only sentimental department in this business, and we ought to be doing it at the rate of $1.25 million a year. If you think these last suggestions sentimental, I'm afraid the next one... Let's have it, Miss Brandeis, Fanger encouraged her quietly. It's... She flashed a mischievous smile at Slosson. It's a mother's guide and helper and adviser. A woman who'll answer questions, give advice. Someone they'll write to, with a picture in their minds of a large, comfortable, motherly-looking person in gray. You know we get hundreds of letters asking whether they ought to order flannel bands or the double-knitted kind, that sort of thing. And who's been answering them? Some 16-year-old girl in the mailing department who doesn't know a flannel band from a booty when she sees it. We could call our woman something pleasant and everydayish, like Emily Brand. Easy to remember. And until we can find her, I'll answer those letters myself. They're important to us, as well as to the woman who writes them. And now, there's the matter of obstetrical outfits. 3 grades, packed ready for shipment. Practical, simple, and complete. Our drug section has the separate articles, but we ought to... Oh, Lord, groaned Slosson, and slumped disgustedly in his seat. But Fanger got up, came over to Fanny, and put a hand on her shoulder for a moment. He looked down at her. I knew you'd do it. He smiled queerly. Tell me, where did you learn all this? I don't know, faltered Fanny happily. Brandeis's Bazaar, perhaps. It's just another case of plush photograph album. Plush? Fanny told him that story. Even the discomfited Slosson grinned at it. But after 10 minutes more of general discussion, Slosson left. Fanger, without putting it in words, had conveyed that to him. Fanny stayed. They did things that way at Haynes Cooper. No waste, no delay. That she had accomplished in 2 months that which ordinarily takes years was not surprising. They did things that way, too, at Haynes Cooper. Take the case of Nathan Haynes himself. And Michael Fanger, too, who, not so many years before, had been a machine boy in a Racine woolen mill. For my part, I confess that Fanny Brandeis begins to lose interest for me. Big business seems to dwarf the finer things in her. That red-cheeked, shabby little schoolgirl, absorbed in Zola and peanut brittle in the Winnebago library, was infinitely more appealing than this glib, capable young woman. The spitting wildcat of the street fight, so long ago, was gentler by far than this cool person who was so deliberately taking his job away from Slosson. You too feel that way about her? That is as it should be. It is the penalty they pay who, given genius, sympathy, and understanding as their birthright, trade them for the tawdry trinkets money brings. Perhaps the last 5 minutes of that conference between Fanny and Michael Fenger reveals a new side, and presents something of interest. It was a harrowing and unexpected 5 minutes. You may remember how Michael Fenger had a way of looking at one, silently. It was an intent and concentrated gaze that had the effect of an actual physical hold. Most people squirmed under it. Fanny, feeling it on her now, frowned and rose to leave. "Shall you want to talk these things over again? Of course I've only outlined them roughly. You gave me so little time." Fenger, at his desk, did not answer, or turn away his gaze. A little blaze of wrath flamed into Fanny's face. "General manager or not," she said, very low-voiced, "I wish you wouldn't sit there and glower at me like that. It's rude and it's disconcerting," which was putting it forthrightly. "I beg your pardon." Fenger came swiftly around the desk and over to her. "I was thinking very hard. Miss Brandeis, will you dine with me somewhere tonight? Then tomorrow night? But I want to talk to you. Here I am. Talk." It was then that Fanny Brandeis saved an ugly situation. For she laughed, a big, wholesome, outdoors sort of laugh. She was honestly amused. "My dear Mr. Fenger, you've been reading the murky magazines. Very bad for you." Fenger was unsmiling. "Why won't you dine with me?" "Because it would be unconventional and foolish. I respect the conventions. They're so sensible. And because it would be unfair to you, and to Mrs. Fenger, and to me." "Rot! It's you who have the murky magazine viewpoint, as you call it, when you imply—" "Now look here, Mr. Fenger," Fanny interrupted quietly. "Let's be square with each other, even if we're not being square with ourselves. You're the real power in this plant because you've got the brains. You can make any person in this organization or break them. That sounds melodramatic, but it's true. I've got a definite life plan, and it's as complete and detailed as an engineering blueprint. I don't intend to let you spoil it. I've made a real start here. If you want to, I've no doubt you can end it. But before you do, I want to warn you that I'll make a pretty stiff fight for it. I'm no silent sufferer. I'll say things. And people usually believe me when I talk." Still the silent, concentrated gaze. With a little impatient exclamation, Fanny walked toward the door. Fenger, startlingly light and agile for his great height, followed. "I'm sorry, Miss Brandeis. Terribly sorry. You see, you interest me very much. Very much." "Thanks." Dryly. "Don't go just yet. Please. I'm not a villain, really. That is, not a deliberate villain. But when I find something very fine, very intricate, very fascinating and complex, like these etchings, for example, I am intrigued. I want it near me. I want to study it." Fanny said nothing, but she thought, "This is a dangerously clever man. Too clever for you. You know so little about them." Fenger waited. Most women would have found refuge in words. The wrong words. It is only the strong who can be silent when in doubt. "Perhaps you will dine with Mrs. Fenger and me at our home some evening? Mrs. Fenger will speak to you about it." "I'm afraid I'm usually too tired for further effort at the end of the day. I'm sorry." "Some Sunday night, perhaps, then. Tea." "Thank you." And so out, past the spare secretary, the anxious-browed stenographer, the academic office boy, to the hallway, the elevator, and finally the refuge of her own orderly desk. Slosson was at lunch in one of the huge restaurants provided for employees in the building across the street. She sat there very still for some minutes, for more minutes than she knew. Her hands were clasped tightly on the desk, and her eyes stared ahead in a puzzled, resentful, bewildered way. Something inside her was saying over and over again, "You lied to him on that very first day. That placed you. That stamped you. Now he thinks you're rotten all the way through. You lied on the very first day." Ella Monahan poked her head in at the door. The gloves were on that floor at the far end. The two women rarely saw each other, except at lunchtime. "Missed you at lunch," said Ella Monahan. She was a pink-cheeked, bright-eyed woman of 41 or 42, prematurely gray and therefore excessively young in her manner, as women often are who have grown gray before their time. Fanny stood up, hurriedly. "I was just about to go." "Try the grape pie, dear. It's delicious." and strolled off down the aisle that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. Fanny stood for a moment looking after her, as though meaning to call her back, but she must have changed her mind because she said, "Oh, nonsense," aloud, and went across to lunch, and ordered grape pie, and enjoyed it. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Fanny Herself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Chapter 10. The invitation to tea came in due time for Mrs. Fanger. A thin, querulous voice over the telephone prepared one for the thin, querulous Mrs. Fanger herself. A sallow, plaintive woman, with a misbehaving valve. The valve, she confided to Fanny, made any effort dangerous. Also, it made her susceptible to drafts. She wore over her shoulders a scarf that was constantly slipping and constantly being retrieved by Michael Fanger. The sight of this man, a physical and mental giant, performing this task ever so gently and patiently, sent a little pang of pity through Fanny, as Michael Fanger knew it would. The Fangers lived in an apartment on Lake Shore Drive, an apartment such as only Chicago boasts. A view, straight across the lake, rooms huge and many-windowed, a glass-enclosed sun porch gay with chintz and wicker, an incredible number of bathrooms. The guests, besides Fanny, included a young pair, newly married and interested solely in rents, hangings, linen closets, and the superiority of the Florentine over the Jacobean for dining-room purposes, and a very scrub-looking, handsome, spectacled man of 32 or 3 who was a mechanical engineer. Fanny failed to catch his name, though she learned it later. Privately she dubbed him Fascinating Facts, and he always remained that. His conversation was invariably prefaced with, "Funny thing happened down at the works today." The rest of it sounded like something one reads at the foot of each page of a loose-leaf desk calendar. At tea there was a great deal of silver and lace, but Fanny thought she could have improved on the chicken a la king. It lacked paprika and personality. Mrs. Fanger was constantly directing one or the other of the neat maids in an irritating aside. After tea Michael Fanger showed Fanny his pictures, not boastfully, but as one who loves them reveals his treasures to an appreciative friend. He showed her his library, too, and it was the library of a reader. Fanny nibbled at it hungrily. She pulled out a book here, a book there, read a paragraph, skimmed a page. There was no attempt at classification. Lever rubbed elbows with Spinoza. Mark Twain dug a facetious thumb into Haeckel's ribs. Fanny wanted to sit down on the floor, legs crossed, before the open shelves, and read, and read, and read. Fanger, watching the light in her face, seemed himself to take on a certain glow, as people generally did who found this girl in sympathy with them. They were deep in book talk when Fascinating Facts strolled in, looking aggrieved, and spoiled it with the thoroughness of one who never reads and is not ashamed of it. "My word, I'm having a rotten time, Fanger," he said plaintively. "They've got a tape measure out of your wife's sewing basket, those two in there, and they're down on their hands and knees, measuring something. It has to do with their rug, over your rug, or some such rot. And then you take Miss Brandeis off and go to the library." "Then stay here," said Fanny, "and talk books." "My book's a blueprint," admitted Fascinating Facts cheerfully. "I never get time to read. There's enough fiction and romance and adventure in my job to give me all the thrill I want. Why, just last Tuesday, no, Thursday it was, down at the works." Between Fanny and Fenger there flashed a look made up of dismay and amusement and secret sympathy. It was a look that said, "We both see the humor of this. Most people wouldn't. Our angle is the same." Such a glance jumps the gap between acquaintance and friendship that whole days of spoken conversation cannot cover. "Cigar?" said Fenger, hoping to stay the flood. "No, thanks. Say, Fenger, would there be a row if I smoked my pipe?" "That black one, with the smell?" "The black one, yes." "There would." Fenger glanced in towards his wife and smiled dryly. Fascinating Facts took his hand out of his pocket, regretfully. "Wouldn't it sour a fellow on marriage? Wouldn't it? First those two in there with their damn linen closets and their rugs. I beg your pardon, Miss Brandeis. And now your missus objects to my pipe. You wouldn't treat me like that, would you, Miss Brandeis?" There was something about him that appealed, something boyish and likable. "No, I wouldn't. I'd let you smoke a nargileh if you wanted to, surrounded by rolls of blueprints." "I knew it. I'm going to drive you home for that." And he did, in his trim little roadster. It is a fairy road at night, that lake drive between the north and south sides. Even the Rush Street Bridge cannot quite spoil it. Fanny sat back luxuriously and let the soft splendor of the late August night enfold her. She was intelligently monosyllabic, while Fascinating Facts talked. At the door of her apartment house (she had left the Mendota weeks before) Fascinating Facts surprised her. "I'd like to see you again, Miss Brandeis, if you'll let me." "I'm so busy," faltered Fanny. Then it came to her that perhaps he did not know. "I'm with Haynes Cooper, you know, assistant buyer in the infants' wear department." "Yes, I know. I suppose a girl like you couldn't be interested in seeing a chap like me again. But I thought maybe—" "But I would," interrupted Fanny impulsively. "Indeed, I would." "Really? Perhaps you'll drive, some evening, over to the Bismarck Gardens or somewhere. It would rest you." "I'm sure it would. Suppose you telephone me." That was her honest, forthright, Winnebago, Wisconsin self talking. But up in her apartment the other Fanny Brandeis, the calculating, ambitious, determined woman, said, "Now why did I say that? I never want to see the boy again." "Use him. Experiment with him. Evidently men are going to enter into this thing. Michael Fanger has, already. And now this boy. Why not try certain tests with them as we used to follow certain formulae in the chemistry laboratory at high school? This compound, that compound, what reaction? Then when the time comes to apply your knowledge, you'll know." Which shows how ignorant she was of this dangerous phase of her experiment. If she had not been, she must have known that these were not chemicals, but explosives with which she proposed to play. The trouble was that Fanny Brandeis, the creative, was not being fed, and the creative fire requires fuel. Fanny Brandeis fed on people, not things. And her work at Haynes Cooper was all with inanimate objects. The 3 months since her coming to Chicago had been crowded and eventful. Haynes Cooper claimed every ounce of her energy, every atom of her wit and resourcefulness. In return it gave salary. Not too much salary. That would come later, perhaps. Unfortunately, Fanny Brandeis did not thrive on that kind of fare. She needed people. She craved contact. All these millions whom she served, these unseen, unheard men and women and children, she wanted to see them. She wanted to touch them. She wanted to talk with them. It was as though a lover of the drama, eager to see his favorite actress in her greatest part, were to find himself viewing her in a badly constructed film play. So Fanny Brandeis took to prowling. There are people who have a penchant for cities. More than that, a talent for them, a gift of sensing them, of feeling their rhythm and pulse beats, as others have a highly developed music sense, or color reaction. It is a thing that cannot be acquired. In Fanny Brandeis there was this abnormal response to the color and tone of any city. And Chicago was a huge, polyglot orchestra made up of players in every possible sort of bizarre costume, performing on every known instrument, leaderless, terrifyingly discordant, yet with an occasional strain, exquisite and poignant, to be heard through the clamor and din. A walk along State Street, the wrong side, or Michigan Avenue at 5, or through one of the city's foreign quarters, or along the lakefront at dusk, stimulated her like strong wine. She was drunk with it. And all the time she would say to herself, little blind fool that she was, "Don't let it get to you. Look at it, but don't think about it. Don't let the human end of it touch you. There's nothing in it." And meanwhile she was feasting on those faces in the crowds. Those faces in the crowds. They seemed to leap out at her. They called to her. So she sketched them, telling herself that she did it by way of relaxation and diversion. One afternoon she left her desk early and perched herself on one of the marble benches that lined the sunken garden just across from the main group of Haynes Cooper buildings. She wanted to see what happened when those great buildings emptied. Even her imagination did not meet the actuality. At 5:30 the streets about the plant were empty, except for an occasional passerby. At 5:31 there trickled down the broad steps of building after building thin, dark streams of humanity, like the first slow line of lava that crawls down the side of an erupting volcano. The trickle broadened into a stream, spread into a flood, became a torrent that inundated the streets, the sidewalks, filling every nook and crevice, a moving mass. 10,000 people! A city! Fanny found herself shaking with excitement, and something like terror at the immensity of it. She tried to get a picture of it, a sketch, with the gleaming windows of the red brick buildings as a background. Amazingly enough she succeeded in doing it. That was because she tried for broad effects, and relied on one bit of detail for her story. It was the face of a girl, a very tired and tawdry girl, of 16 perhaps. On her face the look that the day's work had stamped there was being wiped gently away by another look, a look that said release, and a sweetheart, and an evening at the movies. Fanny, in some miraculous way, got it. She prowled in the ghetto, and sketched those patient, Jewish faces, often grotesque, sometimes repulsive, always mobile. She wandered down South Clark Street, flaring with purple-white arc lights, and looked in at its windows that displayed a pawnbroker's glittering wares, or, just next door, a flat-topped stove over which a white-capped magician whose face smacked of the galley performed deft tricks with a pancake turner. Southern Chicken Dinner, a lying sign read, with waffles and real maple syrup, 35 cents. Past these windows promenaded the Clark Street women, hard-eyed, high-heeled, aigretted. On the street corners loafed the Clark Street men, blue-shaven, wearing checked suits, soiled fawn-top shoes, and diamond scarf pins. And even as she watched them, fascinated, they vanished. Clark Street changed overnight, and became a business thoroughfare, lined with stately office buildings, boasting marble and gold-leaf banks, filled with hurrying clerks, stenographers, and prosperous bond salesmen. It was like a sporting man who, thriving in middle age, endeavors to live down his shady past. Fanny discovered Cottage Grove Avenue, and Halsted Street, and Jefferson, and South State, where she should never have walked. There is an ugliness about Chicago's ugly streets that, for sheer naked brutality, is equaled nowhere in the world. London has its foul streets, smoke-blackened, sinister, but they are ugly as crime is ugly, and as fascinating. It is like the ugliness of an old hag who has lived a life, and who could tell you strange tales if she would. Walking through them you think of Fagin, of Children of the Ghetto, of Tales of Mean Streets. Naples is honeycombed with narrow, teeming alleys, grimed with the sediment of centuries, colored like old Stilton, and smelling much worse. And where is there another Cottage Grove Avenue? Sylvan misnomer. A hideous street, and sordid. A street of flat-wheeled cars, of delicatessen shops and moving picture houses, of clanging bells, of frowsy women, of men who dart around corners with pitchers, their coat collars turned up to hide the absence of linen. One day Fanny found herself at 51st Street, and there before her lay Washington Park, with its gracious meadow, its Italian garden, its rose walk, its lagoon, and drooping willows. But then that was Chicago, all contrast. The Illinois Central Railroad puffed contemptuous cinders into the great blue lake, and almost in the shadow of the City Hall nestled Bathhouse John's groggery. Michigan Avenue fascinated her most. Here was a street developing before one's eyes. To walk on it was like being present at a birth. It is one of the few streets in the world. New York has 2, Paris 100, London none, Vienna 1. Berlin, before the war, knew that no one walked Unter den Linden but American tourists and German shopkeepers from the provinces with their fat wives. But this Michigan Boulevard, unfinished as Chicago itself, shifting and changing daily, still manages to take on a certain form and rugged beauty. It has about it a gracious breath. As you turn into it from the crash and thunder of Wabash, there comes to you a sense of peace. That's the sweep of it, and the lake just beyond, for Michigan Avenue is a one-side street. Its west side is a sheer mountain wall of office buildings, clubs, and hotels, whose ground floors are fascinating with specialty shops. A milliner tantalizes the passerby with a single hat stuck knowingly on a carved stick. An art store shows 2 etchings and a vase. A jeweler's window holds square blobs of emeralds on velvet, and perhaps a gold mesh bag, sprawling limp and invertebrate, or a diamond and platinum La Valliere, chastely barbaric. Past these windows, from Randolph to 12th, surges the crowd, matinee girls, all white fox, and giggles and orchids, wise-eyed saleswomen from the smart specialty shops, dressed in next week's mode, art students hugging their precious flat packages under their arms, immigrants in corduroys and shawls, just landed at the 12th Street station, sightseeing families dazed and weary from Kansas, tailored and sabled Lakeshore Drive dwellers, convention delegates spilling out of the Auditorium Hotel, red-faced, hoarse, with satin badges pinned to their coats, and their hats, the wrong kind, stuck far back on their heads, music students to whom Michigan Avenue means the Fine Arts Building. There you have the West Side. But just across the street the walk is as deserted as though a pestilence lurked there. Here the Art Institute rears its smoke-blackened face, and Grant Park's greenery struggles bravely against the poisonous breath of the Illinois Central engines. Just below 12th Street, block after block shows the solid plate glass of the automobile shops, their glittering wares displayed against an absurd background of Oriental rugs, Tiffany lamps, potted plants, and mahogany. In these windows pose the salesmen, no less sleek and glittering than their wares. Just below these, for a block or two, rows of sinister-looking houses, fallen into decay, with slatternly women lolling at their windows, and gas jets flaring blue in dim hallways. Below 18th, still another change, where the fat stone mansions of Chicago's old families, save the mark, hide their diminished heads behind signs that read, Marguerite, Robe et Manteau, and Smolkin, Tailor. Now you know that women buyers for mail-order houses do not spend their Saturday afternoons and Sundays thus, prowling about a city streets. Fanny Brandeis knew it, too, in her heart. She knew that the Ella Monahans of her world spent their holidays in stayless relaxation, manicuring, mending a bit, skimming the Sunday papers, massaging crow's feet somewhat futilely. She knew that women buyers do not, as a rule, catch their breath with delight at the sight of the pock-marked old Field Columbian Museum in Jackson Park, softened and beautified by the kindly gray chiffon of the lake mist, and tinted by the rouge of the sunset glow, so that it is a thing of spectral loveliness. Successful mercantile women, seeing the furnace glare of the South Chicago steel mills flaring a sullen red against the lowering sky, do not draw a disquieting mental picture of men toiling there, naked to the waist, and glistening with sweat in the devouring heat of the fires. I don't know how she tricked herself. I suppose she said it was the city's appeal to the country dweller, but she lied, and she knew she was lying. She must have known it was the spirit of Molly Brandeis in her, and of Molly Brandeis's mother, and of her mother's mother's mother, down the centuries to Sarah, repressed women, suffering women, troubled, patient, nomadic women, struggling now in her for expression. And Fanny Brandeis went doggedly on, buying and selling infants' wear, and doing it expertly. Her office desk would have interested you. It was so likely to be littered with the most appealing bits of apparel. A pair of tiny crocheted booties, pink and white, a sturdy linen smock, a silken hood so small that one's doubled fist filled it. The new catalogue was on the presses. Fanny had slaved over it, hampered by Slosson. Fanger had given her practically a free hand. Results would not come in for many days. The Christmas trade would not tell the tale, for that was always a time of abnormal business. The dull season following the holiday rush would show the real returns. Slosson was discouragement itself. His attitude was not resentful, it was pitying, and that frightened Fanny. She wished he would storm a little. Then she read her department catalog proof sheets, and these reassured her. They were attractive, and the new baby book had turned out very well, with a colored cover that would appeal to anyone who had ever been or seen a baby. September brought a letter from Theodore. A letter from Theodore meant just one thing. Fanny hesitated a moment before opening it. She always hesitated before opening Theodore's letters. While she hesitated, the old struggle would rage in her. I don't owe him anything, the thing within her would say. God knows I don't. What have I done all my life but give and give and give to him? I'm a woman. He's a man. Let him work with his hands as I do. He's had his share. More than his share. Nevertheless, she had sent him 1,000 of the 6,000 her mother had bequeathed to her. She didn't want to do it. She fought doing it. But she did it. Now, as she held this last letter in her hands and stared at the Bavarian stamp, she said to herself, he wants something. Money. If I send him some I can't have that new tailor suit. Or the furs. And I need them. I'm going to have them. She tore open the letter. Dear old Fan, Olga and I are back in Munich, as you see. I think we'll be here all winter, though Olga hates it. She says it isn't lustig. Well, it isn't Vienna, but I think there's a chance for a class here of American pupils. Munich's swarming with Americans, whole families who come here to live for a year or two. I think I might get together a very decent class, backed by Auer's recommendations. Teaching! Good God, how I hate it! But Auer is planning a series of 20 concerts for me. They ought to be a success if slaving can do it. I work 6 hours a day all summer. I wanted to spend the summer, most of it that is, in Holzhausen am Ammersee, which is a little village or artist colony in the valley, an hour's ride from here, and within sight of the Bavarian Alps. We had Kurt Stein's little villa for almost nothing. But Olga was bored, and she wasn't well, poor girl, so we went to Interlaken, and it was awful. And that brings me to what I want to tell you. There's going to be a baby. No use saying I'm glad, because I'm not, and neither is Olga. About February, I think. Olga has been simply wretched, but the doctor says she'll feel better from now on. The truth of it is she needs a lot of things, and I can't give them to her. I told you I'd been working on this concerto of mine. Sometimes I think it's the real thing, if only I could get the leisure and the peace of mind I need to work on it. You don't know what it means to be eaten up with ambition and to be handicapped. Oh, don't I? Said Fanny Brandeis between her teeth, and crumpled the letter in her strong fingers. Don't I? She got up from her chair and began to walk up and down her little office, up and down. A man often works off his feelings thus, a woman rarely. Fanger, who had not been twice in her office since her coming to the Haynes Cooper plant, chose this moment to visit her, his hands full of papers, his head full of plans. He sensed something wrong at once, as a highly organized human instrument responds to a similarly constructed one. What's wrong, girl? Everything, and don't call me girl. Fanger saw the letter crushed in her hand. Brother? She had told him about Theodore, and he had been tremendously interested. Yes. Money again, I suppose? Yes, but... You know your salary's going up after Christmas. Catalog or no catalog? Catalog or no catalog. Why? Because you've earned it. Fanny faced him squarely. I know that Haynes Cooper isn't exactly a philanthropic institution. A salary raise here usually means a battle. I've only been here 3 months. Fanger seated himself in the chair beside her desk and ran a cool finger through the sheaf of papers in his hand. My dear girl, I beg your pardon, I forgot. My good woman, then, if you like that better. You've transfused red blood into a dying department. It may suffer a relapse after Christmas, but I don't think so. That's why you're getting more money, and not because I happen to be tremendously interested in you, personally. Fanny's face flamed scarlet. I didn't mean that. Yes, you did. Here are those comparative lists you sent me. If I didn't know Slosson to be as honest as old dog Tray, I'd think he'd been selling us to the manufacturers. No wonder this department hasn't paid. He's been giving 'em top prices for shoddy. Now what's this new plan of yours? In an instant Fanny forgot about Theodore, the new winter suit and furs, everything but the idea that was clamoring to be born. She sat at her desk, her fingers folding and unfolding a bit of paper, her face all light and animation as she talked. My idea is to have a person known as a selector for each important department. It would mean a boiling down of the products of every manufacturer we deal with, and skimming the cream off the top. As it is now, a department buyer has to do the selecting and buying too. He can't do both and get results. We ought to set aside an entire floor for the display of manufacturers' samples. The selector would make his choice among these 6 months in advance of the season. The selector would go to the Eastern markets too, of course. Not to buy, merely to select. Then, with the line chosen as far as style, quality, and value is concerned, the buyer would be free to deal directly with the manufacturer as to quantity, time, and all that. You know as well as I that that's enough of a job for any one person, with the labor situation what it is. He wouldn't need to bother about styles or colors or any of that. It would have been all done for him. The selector would have the real responsibility. Don't you see the simplicity of it? The way it would grease the entire machinery? Something very like jealousy came into Michael Fenger's face as he looked at her, but it was gone in an instant. Gad, you'll have my job away from me in 2 years. You're a superwoman, do you know that? Super nothing. It was just a perfectly good idea, founded on common sense and economy. Mm-hmm. But that's all Columbus had in mind when he started out to find a shortcut to India. Fanny laughed out at that. Yes, but see where he landed. But Fanger was serious. We'll have to have a meeting on this. Are you prepared to go into detail on it, before Mr. Haynes and the 2 Coopers? At a real meeting in a real mahogany director's room? Wednesday, say? I think so. Fanger got up. Look here, Miss Brandeis. You need a day in the country. Why don't you run up to your home town over Sunday? Wisconsin, wasn't it? Oh, no. No, I mean, yes, it was Wisconsin, but no, I don't want to go." "Then let me send you my car." "Car? No, thanks. That's not my idea of the country." "It was just a suggestion. What do you call going to the country, then?" "Tramping all day, and getting lost, if possible. Lying down under a tree for hours, and letting the ants amble over you. Dreaming. And coming back tired, hungry, dusty, and refreshed." "It sounds awfully uncomfortable. But I wish you'd try it. This week." "Do I look such a wreck?" Fanny demanded, rather pettishly. "You?" Fenger's voice was vibrant. "You're the most splendidly alive-looking woman I ever saw. When you came into my office that first day you seemed to spark with health, and repressed energy and electricity so that you radiated them. People who can do that stimulate. That's what you are to me, a stimulant." What can one do with a man who talks like that? After all, what he said was harmless enough. His tone was quietly sincere. One can't resent an expression of the eyes. Then, too, just as she made up her mind to be angry, she remembered the limp and querulous Mrs. Fanger, and the valve, and the scarf, and her anger became pity. There flashed back to her the illuminating bit of conversation with which Fascinating Facts had regaled her on the homeward drive that night of the tea. "Nice chap, Fenger, and a whiz in business. Gets a king's salary. Must be hell for a man to be tied hand and foot the way he is." "Tied?" "Mrs. Fenger's a semi-invalid. At that, I don't believe she's as helpless as she seems. I think she just holds him by that shawl of hers that's forever slipping. You know he was a machine boy in her father's woolen mill? She met him after he'd worked his way up to an office job. He has forged ahead like a locomotive ever since." That had been their conversation. Gossipy, but tremendously enlightening for Fanny. She looked up at him now. "Thanks for the vacation suggestion. I may go off somewhere. Just a last-minute leap. It usually turns out better that way. I'll be ready for the Wednesday discussion." She sounded very final and busy. The crumpled letter lay on her desk. She smoothed it out, and the crumple transferred itself to her forehead. Fenger stood a moment, looking down at her. Then he turned abruptly and left the office. Fanny did not look up. That was Friday. On Saturday her vacation took a personally conducted turn. She had planned to get away at noon, as most office heads did on Saturday during the warm weather. When her phone rang at 11, she answered it mechanically, as does one whose telephone calls mean a row with a tardy manufacturer, an argument with a merchandise man, or a catalog query from the printers. The name that came to her over the telephone conveyed nothing to her. "Who?" Again the name. "Hale?" She repeated the name uncertainly. "I'm afraid I Oh, of course, Clarence Hale. Howdy do." "I want to see you," said the voice promptly. There rose up in Fanny's mind a cruelly clear picture of the little, sallow, sniveling schoolboy of her girlhood. The little boy with the big glasses and the shiny shoes, and the weak lungs. "Sorry," she replied promptly, "but I'm afraid it's impossible. I'm leaving the office early, and I'm swamped." Which was a lie. "This evening?" "I rarely plan anything for the evening. Too tired, as a rule." "Too tired to drive?" "I'm afraid so." A brief silence. Then, "I'm coming out there to see you." "Where? Here? The plant? That's impossible, Mr. Hale. I'm terribly sorry, but I can't." "Yes, I know. Also terribly sure that if I ever get to you it will be over your office boy's dead body. Well, arm him. I'm coming. Good by." "Wait a minute. Mr. Hale! Clarence! Hello? Hello?" A jiggling of the hook. "Number, please," droned the voice of the operator. Fanny jammed the receiver down on the hook and turned to her work, lips compressed, a frown forming a double cleft between her eyes. Half an hour later he was there. Her office boy brought in his card, as she had rehearsed him to do. Fanny noted that it was the wrong kind of card. She would show him what happened to pushers who pestered business women during office hours. "Bring him in 20 minutes," she said grimly. Her office boy and slave always took his cue from her. She hoped he wouldn't be too rude to Hale, and turned back to her work. 39 seconds later Clarence Hale walked in. "Hello, Fan," he said, and had her limp hand in a grip that made her wince. "But I told—" "Yes, I know, but he's a crushed and broken office boy by now. I had to be real harsh with him." Fanny stood up, really angry now. She looked up at Clarence Hale, and her eyes were flashing. Clarence Hale looked down at her, and his eyes were the keenest, kindest, most gently humorous eyes she had ever encountered. You know that picture of Lincoln that shows us his eyes with much that expression in them? That's as near as I can come to conveying to you the whimsical pathos in this man. They were the eyes of a lonely little boy grown up, and they had seen much in the process. Fanny felt her little blaze of anger flicker and die. "That's the girl," said Hale, and patted her hand. "You'll like me, presently, after you've forgotten about that sniveling kid you hated." He stepped back a pace and threw back his coat senatorially. "How do I look?" he demanded. "Look?" repeated Fanny feebly. "I've been hours preparing for this. Years. And now something tells me this tie, for instance." Fanny bit her lip in a vain effort to retain her solemnity. Then she gave it up and giggled frankly. "Well, since you ask me, that tie—" "What's the matter with it?" Fanny giggled again. "It's red, that's what." "Well, what of it? Red's all right. I've always considered red one of our leading colors." "But you can't wear it." "Can't? Why can't I?" "Because you're the brunest kind of brunette, and dark people have a special curse hanging over them that makes them want to wear red. It's fatal. That tie makes you look like a mafia murderer dressed for business." "I knew it," groaned Hale. "Something told me." He sank into a chair at the side of her desk, a picture of mock dejection. "And I chose it, deliberately. I had black ones, and blue ones, and green ones. And I chose this." He covered his face with a shaking hand. Fanny Brandeis leaned back in her chair and laughed and laughed and laughed. Surely she hadn't laughed like that in a year, at least. "You're a madman," she said finally. At that Hale looked up with his singularly winning smile. "But different. Concede that, Fanny. Be fair now. Refreshingly different." "Different," said Fanny, "doesn't begin to cover it. Well, now you're here, tell me what you're doing here." "Seeing you." "I mean here, in Chicago." "So do I. I'm on my way from Winnebago to New York, and I'm in Chicago to see Fanny Brandeis." "Don't expect me to believe that." Hale put an arm on Fanny's desk and leaned forward, his face very earnest. "I do expect you to believe it. I expect you to believe everything I say to you. Not only that, I expect you not to be surprised at anything I say. I've done such a mass of private thinking about you in the last 10 years that I'm likely to forget I've scarcely seen you in that time. Just remember, will you, that like the girl in the sob song, you made me what I am today? You're being humorous again. Never less so in my life. Listen, Fan. That cowardly, sickly little boy you fought for in the street that day in Winnebago showed every sign of growing up a cowardly, sickly man. You're the reason for his not doing so. Now wait a minute. I was an impressionable little kid, I guess. Sickly ones are apt to be. I worshipped you and hated you from that day. Worshipped you for the blazing, generous, whole-souled little devil of a spitfire that you were. Hated you because, well, what boy wouldn't hate a girl who had to fight for him? Gosh! It makes me sick to think of it, even now. Pasty-faced rat! "What nonsense! I'd forgotten all about it." "No, you hadn't. Tell me, what flashed into your mind when you saw me in Temple that night before you left Winnebago? The truth, now." She learned, later, that people did not lie to him. She tried it now, and found herself saying rather shamefacedly, "I thought, why, it's Clarence Hale, the cowardy cat." "There! That's why I'm here today. I knew you were thinking that. I knew it all the time I was in Colorado, growing up from a sickly kid with a bum lung to a heap big, strong man. It forced me to do things I was afraid to do. It goaded me on to stunts at the very thought of which I'd break out in a clammy sweat. Don't you see how I'll have to turn handsprings in front of you, like the schoolboy in the McCutcheon cartoon? Don't you see how I'll have to flex my muscles, like this, to show you how strong I am? I may even have to beat you, eventually. Why, child, I've chummed with lions and bears and wolves and everything, because of you, you little devil in the red cap. I've climbed unclimbable mountains. I've frozen my feet in blizzards. I've wandered for days on a mountain top, lost, living on dried currants and milk chocolate. And Lord, how I hate milk chocolate! I've dodged snowslides and slept in trees. I've endured cold and hunger and thirst through you. It took me years to get used to the idea of passing a timber wolf without looking round, but I learned to do it because of you. You made me. They sent me to Colorado, a lonely kid, with a pretty fair chance of dying, and I would have if it hadn't been for you. There! How's that for a burst of speech, young woman? And wait a minute. Remember, too, my name was Clarence. I had that to live down." Fanny was staring at him, eyes round, lips parted. "But why?" she said faintly. "Why?" Hale smiled with that singularly winning smile of his. "Since you force me to it, I think I'm in love with that little warm-hearted spitfire in the red cap. That's why." Fanny sat forward now. She had been leaning back in her chair, her hands grasping its arms, her face a lovely, mobile thing, across which laughter and pity and sympathy and surprise rippled and played. It hardened now, and set. She looked down at her hands, and clasped them in her lap, and then up at him. "In that case you can forsake the strenuous life with a free conscience. You need never climb another mountain or wrestle with another hippopotamus. That little girl in the red cap is dead." "Dead?" "Yes. She died a year ago. If the one who has taken her place were to pass you on the street today, and see you beset by 40 thieves, she'd not even stop. Not she. She'd say, 'Let him fight it out alone. It's none of your business. You've got your own fights to handle.'" "Why, Fanny, you don't mean that, do you? What could have made her like that?" "She's just discovered that fighting for others didn't pay. She just happened to know someone else who had done that all her life, and it killed her." "Her mother?" "Yes." A little silence. "Fanny, let's play outdoors tomorrow, will you? All day." Involuntarily Fanny glanced around the room. Papers, catalogs, files, desk, chair, typewriter. "I'm afraid I've forgotten how." "I'll teach you. You look as if you could stand a little of it." "I must be a pretty sight. You're the second man to tell me that in 2 days." Hale leaned forward a little. "That so? Who's the other one?" "Fanger, the general manager." "Oh. Paternal old chap, I suppose. No? Well, anyway, I don't know what he had in mind, but you're going to spend Sunday at the dunes of Indiana with me." "Dunes of Indiana?" "There's nothing like them in the world. Literally. In September that combination of yellow sand and blue lake and the woods beyond is well, you'll see what it is. It's only a little more than an hour's ride by train, and it will just wipe that tired look out of your face, Fan." He stood up. "I'll call for you tomorrow morning at 8, or thereabouts. That's early for Sunday, but it's going to be worth it." "I can't, really. Besides, I don't think I even want to. "I promise not to lecture on nature if that's what's worrying you." He took her hand in a parting grip. "Bring some sandwiches, will you? Quite a lot of 'em. I'll have some other stuff in my rucksack. And wear some clothes you don't mind wrecking. I suppose you haven't got a red tam o' shanter." "Heavens, no!" "I just thought it might help to keep me humble." He was at the door, and so was she, somehow, her hand still in his. 8 o'clock. How do you stand it in this place, Fan? Oh, well, I'll find that out tomorrow. Good bye." Fanny went back to her desk and papers. The room seemed, all at once, impossibly stuffy. Her papers and letters dry, meaningless things. In the next office, separated from her by a partition half glass, half wood, she saw the top of Slosson's bald head as he stood up to shut his old-fashioned, roll-top desk. He was leaving. She looked out of the window. Ella Monahan, in hat and suit, passed and came back to poke her head in at the door. "Run along," she said. "It's Saturday afternoon. You'll work overtime enough when the Christmas rush begins. Come on, child, and call it a day." And Fanny gathered papers, figures, catalog proofs into a glorious heap, thrust them into a drawer, locked the drawer, pushed back her chair, and came. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Fanny Herself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Chapter 11. Fanny told herself before she went to bed Saturday night that she hoped it would rain Sunday morning from 7 to 12. But when Princess woke her at 7:30, as per instructions left in penciled scrawl on the kitchen table, she turned to the window at once, and was glad, somehow, to find it sun-flooded. Princess, if you're mystified, was royal in name only, a biscuit-tinted lady with a very black and no-account husband, whose habits made it necessary for Princess to let herself into Fanny's four-room flat at 7 every morning, and let herself out at 8 every evening. She had an incredibly soft and musical voice, had Princess, and a cooking hand. She kept Fanny mended, fed, and comfortable, and her only cross was that Fanny's taste in blouses, ultimately her property, ran to the severe and tailored. "Mawnin', Miss Fanny. There's a gent'man waitin' to see yo'." Fanny choked on a yawn. "A what?" "Gent'man. Says yo' all goin' picnickin'. He's in the settin' room, and a-lookin' at yo' picture papers. Will I fry you up a little chicken to pack along? Sandwiches ain't no eatin' fo' Sunday." Fanny flung back her covers, swung around to the side of the bed, and stood up, all seemingly in one sweeping movement. "Do you mean to tell me he's in there now?" From the sitting room. "I think I ought to tell you. I can hear everything you're saying. Say, Fanny, those sketches of yours are why, gee whiz! I didn't know you did that kind of thing. This one here, with that girl's face in the crowd." "For heaven's sake," Fanny demanded, "what are you doing here at 7:30? And I don't allow people to look at those sketches. You said 8:30." "I was afraid you'd change your mind or something. Besides, it's now 22 minutes to 8. And will you tell the lady that's a wonderful idea about the chicken? Only she'd better start now." Goaded by time bulletins shouted through the closed door, Fanny found herself tubbed, clothed, and ready for breakfast by 8:10. When she opened the door, Clarence was standing in the center of her little sitting room, waiting, a sheaf of loose sketches in his hand. "Say, look here! These are the real thing. Why, they're great! They get you. This old geezer with the beard selling fish and looking like one of the disciples. And this. What the devil are you doing in a mail order house, or whatever it is? Tell me that. When you can draw like this." "Good morning," said Fanny calmly. "And I'll tell you nothing before breakfast. The one thing that interests me this moment is hot coffee. Will you have some breakfast?" "Oh, well, a second time won't hurt you. You must have got up at 3 or thereabouts." She went toward the tiny kitchen. "Never mind, Princess, I'll wait on myself. You go on with that chicken." Princess was the kind of person who can fry a chicken, wrap it in cool, crisp lettuce leaves, box it, cut sandwiches, and come out of the process with an unruffled temper and an immaculate kitchen. Thanks to her, Fanny and Hale found themselves on the 8:53 train bound for the dunes. Clarence swung his rucksack up to the bundle rack. He took off his cap and stuffed it into his pocket. He was grinning like a schoolboy. Fanny turned from the window and smiled at what she saw in his face. At that he gave an absurd little bounce in his place, like an overgrown child, and reached over and patted her hand. "I've dreamed of this for years." "You're just 14, going on 15," Fanny reproved him. "I know it, and it's great. Won't you be, too? Forget you're a fair financier, or whatever they call it. Forget you earn more in a month than I do in 6. Relax. Unbend. Loosen up. Don't assume that hard-shell air with me. Just remember that I knew you when the frill of your panties showed below your skirt." "Clarence Hale!" But he was leaning past her and pointing out of the window. "See that curtain of smoke off there? That's the South Chicago and the Hammond and Gray steel mills. Wait till you see those smokestacks against the sky, and the iron scaffoldings that look like giant lacework, and the slag heaps, and the coal piles, and those huge grim tanks. Gad, it's awful and beautiful, like the things Pinnell does." "I came out here on a streetcar one day," said Fanny quietly. "One Sunday." "You did?" He stared at her. "It was hot, and they were all spilling out into the street. You know, the women in wrappers, just blobs of flesh, trying to get cool. And the young girls in their pink silk dresses and white shoes. And the boys on the street corners calling to them. Babies all over the sidewalks and streets. And the men who weren't in the mills, you know how they look in their Sunday shirt sleeves, with their flat faces and high cheekbones, and their great brown hands with the broken nails. Hunkies. Well, at 5 the motor cars began whizzing by from the country roads back to Chicago. You have to go back that way. Just when the 5 o'clock whistles blew and the day shift came off. There was a great army of them, clumping down the road the way they do. Their shoulders were slack, and their lunch pails dangled empty, and they were wet and reeking with sweat. The motor cars were full of wild phlox and daisies and spiderwort. Clarence was still turned sideways, looking at her. "Get a picture of it?" "Yes, I tried, at least." "Is that the way you usually spend your Sundays?" "Well, I like snooping about." "Hmm," mused Clarence. Then, "How's business, Fanny?" "Business?" You could almost feel her mind jerk back. "Oh, let's not talk about business on Sunday." "I thought so," said Clarence enigmatically. "Now listen to me, Fanny." "I'll listen," interrupted she, "if you'll talk about yourself. I want to know what you're doing, and why you're going to New York. What business can a naturalist have in New York, anyway?" "I didn't intend to be a naturalist. You can tell that by looking at me. But you can't have your very nose rubbed up against trees and rocks and mountains and snow for years and years without learnin' something about 'em. There were whole weeks when I hadn't anything to chum with but a timberline pine and an odd assortment of mountain peaks. We just had to get acquainted. But you're going back, aren't you? Don't they talk about the spell of the mountains or some such thing? They do, and they're right. And I've got to have them 6 months in the year, at least. But I'm going to try spending the other 6 in the bosom of the human race. Not only that, I'm going to write about it. Writing's my job, really. At least it's the thing I like best. Nature? Human nature. I went out to Colorado, just a lonesome little kid with a bum lung. The lung's all right, but I never did quite get over the other. 2 years ago, in the mountains, I met Carl Lasker, who owns the New York Star. It's said to be the greatest morning paper in the country. Lasker's a genius, and he fries the best bacon I ever tasted. I took him on a 4 weeks horseback trip through the mountains. We got pretty well acquainted. At the end of it, he offered me a job. You see, I'd never seen a chorus girl, or the Woolworth Building, or a cabaret, or a broiled lobster, or a subway. But I was interested and curious about all of them. And Lasker said, a man who can humanize a rock, or a tree, or a chipmunk ought to be able to make even those things seem human. You've got what they call the fresh viewpoint. New York's full of people with a scum over their eyes, but a lot of them came to New York from Winnebago, or towns just like it, and you'd be surprised at the number of them who still get their hometown paper. One day, when I went into Lee Cole's office, with stars and leading men and all that waiting outside to see him, he was sitting with his feet on the desk, reading the Sheffield, Illinois Gazette. You see, the thing he thinks I can do is to give them a picture of New York as they used to see it, before they got colorblind. A column or so a day, about anything that hits me. How does that strike you as a job for a naturalist? It's a job for a human naturalist. I think you'll cover it. If you know the Dunes, which you probably don't, you know why they did not get off at Miller's with the crowd, but rode on until they were free of the Sunday picnickers. Then they got off and walked across the tracks, past saloons and a few huddled houses, hideous in yellow paint, and on down a road that seemed endless. A stretch of cinders, then dust, a rather stiff little hill, a great length of yellow sand, and the lake. We say "the lake" like that, with an exclamation point after it, because it wasn't at all the Lake Michigan that Chicagoans know. This vast blue glory bore no relation to the sullen, gray, turbid thing that the city calls the lake. It was all the blues of which you've ever heard, and every passing cloud gave it a new shade. Sapphire, no, cobalt, no, that's too cold, Mediterranean, turquoise, and the sand in golden contrast. Miles of sand along the beach, and back of that the dunes. Now any dictionary or Scotchman will tell you that a dune is a hill of loose sand. But these dunes are done in American fashion, lavishly. Mountains of sand, as far as the eye can see, and on top of them, incredibly, great pine trees that clutch at their perilous, shifting foothold with frantic root toes. And behind that, still more incredibly, the woods, filled with wildflowers, with strange growths found nowhere else in the whole land, with trees and vines and brush, and always the pungent scent of the pines. And there you have the dunes, blue lake, golden sand hills, green forest, in one. Fanny and Clarence stood there on the sand, in silence, 2 ridiculously diminutive figures in that great wilderness of beauty. I wish I could get to you, somehow, the clear sparkle of it, the brilliance of it, and yet the peace of it. They stood there a long time, those 2, without speaking. Then Fanny shut her eyes, and I think her lower lip trembled just a little. And Clarence patted her hand just twice. I thank you, he said, in the name of that much-abused lady known as Nature. Said Fanny, I want to scramble up to the top of one of those dunes, the high one, and just sit there. And that is what they did. A poor enough Sunday, I suppose, in the minds of those of you who spend yours golfing at the club, or motoring along grease-soaked roads that lead to a shore dinner and a ukulele band. But it turned Fanny Brandeis back a dozen years or more, so that she was again the little girl whose heart had ached at the sight of the pale rose and orange of the Wisconsin winter sunsets. She forgot all about layettes and obstetrical outfits and flannel bands and safety pins. Her mind was a blank in the matter of booties and catalogs, and our number 29E8347, and those hungry bins that always yawned for more. She forgot about Michael Fanger and Theodore and the new furs. They scrambled up dunes, digging into the treacherous sand with heels, toes, and the side of the foot, clutching at fickle roots with frantic fingers. Forward a step, and back 2, That's dune climbing. A back-breaking business unless you're young and strong, as were these two. They explored the woods, and Hale had a fascinating way of talking about stones and shrubs and trees as if they were endowed with human qualities, as indeed they were for him. They found a hill slope carpeted with dwarf huckleberry plants, still bearing tiny clusters of the blue-black fruit. Fanny's heart was pounding, her lungs ached, her cheeks were scarlet, her eyes shining. Hale, steel-muscled, took the hills like a chamois. Once they crossed hands atop a dune and literally skated down it, right, left, shrieking with laughter, and ending in a heap at the bottom. "In the name of all that's idiotic!" shouted Hale. "Silk stockings! What in thunder made you wear silk stockings? At the sand dunes! Gosh!" They ate their dinner in Olympic splendor atop a dune. Hale produced unexpected things from the rucksack. Things that ranged all the way from milk chocolate to literature, and from grape juice to cigarettes. They ate ravenously, but at Hale's thrifty suggestion they saved a few sandwiches for the late afternoon. It was he, too, who made a little bonfire of paper, crusts, and bones, as is the cleanly habit of your true woodsman. Then they stretched out, full length, in the noon sun, on the warm, clean sand. "What's your best price on 1/6 dozen flannel vests?" inquired Hale. And, "Oh, shut up!" said Fanny elegantly. Hale laughed as one who hugs a secret. "We'll work our way down the beach," he announced, "toward Miller's. There'll be northern lights tonight, did you know that? Want to stay and see them?" "Do I want to? I won't go home till I have." These were the things they did on that holiday. Childish, happy, tiring things, such as people do who love the outdoors. The charm of Clarence Hale, for he had charm, is difficult to transmit. His lovableness and appeal lay in his simplicity. It was not so much what he said as in what he didn't say. He was staring unwinkingly now at the sunset that had suddenly burst upon them. His were the eyes of one accustomed to the silent distances. "Takes your breath away, rather, doesn't it? All that color?" said Fanny, her face toward the blaze. "Almost too obvious for my taste. I like 'em a little more subdued, myself." They were atop a dune, and he stretched himself flat on the sand, still keeping his bright brown eyes on lake and sky. Then he sat up excitedly. "Heh! Try that. Lie flat. It softens the whole thing, like this. Now look at it. The lake's like molten copper flowing in, and you can see that silly sun going down in jerks, like a balloon on a string." They lay there silent while the scarlet became orange, the orange faded to rose, the rose to pale pink, to salmon, to mauve, to gray. The first pale star came out, and the brazen lights of Gary, far to the north, defied it. Fanny sat up with a sigh and a little shiver. "Fasten that sweater around your throat," said Hale. "Got a pin?" They munched their sandwiches, rather soggy by now, and drank the last of the grape juice. "We'll have a bite of hot supper in town at a restaurant that doesn't mind Sunday trampers. Come on, Fan. We'll start down the beach until the northern lights begin to show." "It's been the most accommodating day," murmured Fanny. "Sunshine, sunset, northern lights, everything. If we were to demand a rainbow and an eclipse, they'd turn those on, too." They started to walk down the beach in the twilight, keeping close to the water's edge, where the sand was moist and firm. It was hard going. They plunged along arm in arm, in silence. Now and again they stopped, with one accord, and looked out over the great gray expanse that lay before them, and then up at the hills and the pines etched in black against the sky. Nothing competitive here, Fanny thought, and took a deep breath. She thought of tomorrow's work, with day after tomorrow's biting and snapping at its heels. Clarence seemed to sense her thoughts. "Doesn't this make you feel that you want to get away from those damned bins that you're forever feeding? I watched those boys for a minute the other day outside your office. Jove!" Fanny dug a heel into the sand savagely. "Some days I feel that I've got to walk out of the office and down the street without a hat, and on, walking and running now and then, till I come to the horizon. That's how I feel, some days." "Then some day, Fanny, that feeling will get too strong for you, and you'll do it. Now listen to me. Tuck this away in your subconscious mind, and leave it there until you need it. When that time comes, get on a train for Denver. From Denver, take another to Estes Park. That's the Rocky Mountains, and they're your destination, because that's where the horizon lives and has its being. When you get there, ask for Hale's place. They'll just hand you from one to the other, gently, until you get there. I may be there, but more likely I shan't. The key's in the mailbox, tied to a string. You'll find a fire already laid in the fireplace, with fat pine knots that will blaze up at the touch of a match. My books are there, along the walls. The bedding's in the cedar chest, and the lamps are filled. There's tin stuff in the pantry. And the mountains are there, girl, to make you clean and whole again. And the pines that are nature's prophylactic brushes. And the sky. And peace. That sounds like a railway folder, but it's true, I know. They trudged along in silence for a while. Got that? Mm-hmm, replied Fanny disinterestedly, without looking at him. Hale's jaw set. You could see the muscles show white for an instant. Then he said, "It has been a wonderful day, Fanny, but you haven't told me a thing about yourself. I'd like to know about your work. I'd like to know what you're doing, what your plan is. You look so darn definite up there in that office. Whom do you play with? And who's this Fanger, wasn't that the name, who said you looked tired?" "All right, Clancy, I'll tell you about it," Fanny agreed briskly. "All right, who?" "Well, I can't call you Clarence. It doesn't fit. So just for the rest of the day, let's make it Clancy, even if you do look like one of the minor Hebrew prophets, minus the beard." And so she began to tell him of her work and her aims. I think that she had been craving just this chance to talk. That which she told him was, unconsciously, a confession. She told him of Theodore and his marriage, of her mother's death, of her coming to Haynes Cooper, and the changes she had brought about there. She showed him the infinite possibilities for advancement there. Slosson she tossed aside. Then, rather haltingly, she told him of Fanger, of his business genius, his magnetic qualities, of his career. She even sketched a deft word picture of the limp and irritating Mrs. Fanger. "Is this Fanger in love with you?" asked Hale, startlingly. Fanny recoiled at the idea with a primness that did credit to Winnebago. "Clancy, please, he's married." "Now don't sneak, Fanny, and don't talk like an ingenue. So far you've outlined a life plan that makes Becky Sharp look like a cooing dove. So just answer this straight, will you?" "Why, I suppose I attract him, as any man of his sort, with a wife like that, would be attracted to a healthy, alert woman, whose ideas match his. And I wish you wouldn't talk to me like that. It hurts." "I'm glad of that. I was afraid you'd passed that stage. Well now, how about those sketches of yours? I suppose you know that they're as good, in a crude, effective sort of way, as anything that's being done today." "Oh, nonsense!" But then she stopped, suddenly, and put both hands on his arm and looked up at him, her face radiant in the gray twilight. "Do you really think they're good?" "You bet they're good. There isn't a newspaper in the country that couldn't use that kind of stuff. And there aren't 3 people in the country who can do it. It isn't a case of being able to draw. It's being able to see life in a peculiar light, and to throw that light so that others get the glow. Those sketches I saw this morning are life, served up raw. That's your gift, Fanny. Why the devil don't you use it?" But Fanny had got herself in hand again. "It isn't a gift," she said lightly. "It's just a little knack that amuses me. There's no money in it. Besides, it's too late now. One's got to do a thing superlatively nowadays to be recognized. I don't draw superlatively. But I do handle infants' wear better than any woman I know. In 2 more years I'll be getting $10,000 a year at Haynes Cooper. In 5 years—" "Then what?" Fanny's hands became fists, gripping the power she craved. "Then I shall have arrived. I shall be able to see the great and beautiful things of this world, and mingle with the people who possess them." "When you might be making them yourself, you little fool. Don't glare at me like that. I tell you that those pictures are the real expression of you. That's why you turn to them as relief from the shop grind. You can't help doing them. They're you." "I can stop if I want to. They amuse me, that's all." "You can't stop. It's in your blood. It's the Jew in you." "Here, I'll show you. I won't do another sketch for a year. I'll prove to you that my ancestors' religion doesn't influence my work or my play." "Dear, you can't prove that, because the contrary has been proven long ago. You yourself proved it when you did that sketch of the old fish vendor in the ghetto. The one with the beard. It took 1,000 years of suffering and persecution and faith to stamp that look on his face, and it took 1,000 years to breed in you the genius to see it and put it down on paper. Fan, did you ever read Fishberg's book?" "No," said Fanny, low-voiced. "Sometime, when you can snatch a moment from the fascinations of the mail order catalog, read it. Fishberg says, I wish I could remember his exact words, it isn't the body that marks the Jew, it's his soul. The type is not anthropological or physical. It's social or psychic. It isn't the complexion, the nose, the lips, the head. It's his soul which betrays his faith. Centuries of ghetto confinement, ostracism, ceaseless suffering have produced a psychic type. The thing that is stamped on the soul seeps through the veins and works its way magically to the face. But I don't want to talk about souls. Please. You're spoiling a wonderful day. And you're spoiling a wonderful life. I don't object to this driving ambition in you. I don't say that you're wrong in wanting to make a place for yourself in the world. But don't expect me to stand by and let you trample over your own immortal soul to get there. Your head is busy enough on this infant's wear job. But how about the rest of you? How about you? What do you suppose all those years of work and suppression and self-denial and beauty hunger there in Winnebago were meant for? Not to develop the mail order business. They were given you so that you might recognize hunger and suppression and self-denial in others. The light in the face of that girl in the crowd pouring out of the plant. What's that but the reflection of the light in you? I tell you, Fanny, we Jews have got a money-grubbing, loud-talking, diamond-studded, get-there-at-any-price reputation. And perhaps we deserve it. But every now and then, out of the mass of us, one lifts his head and stands erect, and the great white light is in his face. And that person has suffered, for suffering breeds genius. It expands the soul, just as over-prosperity shrivels it. You see it all the way from Lou Fields to Sarah Bernhardt, from Mendelssohn to Irving Berlin, from Mishka Elman to Charlie Chaplin. You were a person set apart in Winnebago. Instead of thanking your God for that, you set out to be something you aren't. No, it's worse than that. You're trying not to be what you are. And it's going to do for you. Stop! Cried Fanny. My head's whirling. It sounds like something out of Alice in Wonderland. And you, retorted Hale, sound like someone who's afraid to talk or think about herself. You're suppressing the thing that is you. You're cutting yourself off from your own people, a dramatic, impulsive, emotional people. By doing those things, you're killing the goose that lays the golden egg. What's that old copybook line? To thine own self be true, and the rest of it? Yes, like Theodore, for example, sneered Fanny. At which unpleasant point, nature kindly supplied a diversion. Across the black sky there shot two luminous shafts of lights. Northern lights, pale sisters of the chromatic glory one sees in the far north, but still weirdly beautiful. Fanny and Hale stopped short, faces upturned. The ghostly radiance wavered, expanded, glowed palely, like celestial searchlights. Suddenly, from the tip of each shaft, there burst a cluster of slender, pinpoint lines, like aigrettes set in a band of silver. Then these slowly wavered, faded, combined to form a third and fourth slender shaft of light. It was like the radiance one sees in the old pictures of the Holy Family. Together, Fanny and Hale watched it in silence, until the last glimmer faded and was gone, and only the brazen lights of Gary, far, far down the beach, cast a fiery glow against the sky. They sighed simultaneously. Then they laughed, each at the other. "Curtain," said Fanny. They raced for the station, despite the sand. Their car was filled with pudgy babies, lying limp in parental arms, with lunch baskets exuding the sickly scent of bananas, with disheveled vandals whose moist palms grasped bunches of wilted wildflowers. Past the belching chimneys of Gary, through South Chicago, the backyard of a metropolis, past Jackson Park that breathed coolly upon them, and so to the city again. They looked at it with the shock that comes to eyes that have rested for hours on long stretches of sand and sky and water. Monday, that had seemed so far away, became an actuality of tomorrow. Tired as they were, they stopped at one of those frank little restaurants that brighten Chicago's drab side streets. Its windows were full of pans that held baked beans, all crusty and brown, and falsely tempting, and of baked apples swimming in a pool of syrup. These flanked by ketchup bottles and geometrical pyramids of golden grapefruit. Coffee and hot roast beef sandwiches, of course, in a place like that. And, added Fanny, one of those baked apples, just to prove they can't be as good as they look. They weren't, but she was too hungry to care. Not too hungry, though, to note with quick eye all that the little restaurant held of interest, nor too sleepy to respond to the friendly waitress who, seeing their dusty boots and the sprig of sumac stuck in Fanny's coat, said, "My, it must have been swell in the country today," as her flapping napkin precipitated crumbs into their laps. "It was," said Fanny, and smiled up at the girl with her generous, flashing smile. "Here's a bit of it I brought back for you." And she stuck the scarlet sumac sprig into the belt of the white apron. They finished the day incongruously by taking a taxi home, Fanny yawning luxuriously all the way. "Do you know," she said as they parted, "we've talked about everything from souls to infants' wear. We're talked out. It's a mercy you're going to New York. There won't be a next time." "Young woman," said Heyl, forcefully, "there will. That young devil in the red tam isn't dead. She's alive and kicking. There's a kick in every one of those Chicago sketches in your portfolio upstairs. You said she wouldn't fight anybody's battles today. You little idiot. She's fighting one in each of those pictures, from the one showing that girl's face in the crowd to the old chap with the fish stall. She'll never die, that one, because she's the spirit. It's the other one who's dead, and she doesn't know it. But some day she'll find herself buried, and I want to be there to shovel on the dirt." End of chapter 11.